The universe began in a hush that felt like potential, not emptiness. Space itself wasn't smooth. It quivered with tiny differences, little ripples laid down in a time so early it barely counts as time. In those ripples, an invisible kind of matter gathered first, building quiet hills and hollows like glass bones under velvet. Around that unseen framework, ordinary gas, hydrogen, and helium drifted and fell, falling warmed it, radiating cooled it, and cooling let it sink deeper, a patient spiral of cause and effect. There was no hurry. Millions of years passed the way a held breath passes, with tension but no drama. In the deepest hollows, gas thickened into clouds the size of small galaxies, and within those clouds, smaller knots formed like seeds inside fruit. The darkness here wasn't absence, it was a stage being cleared. The fog thinned. Temperatures dropped. Collisions between atoms became whispers of promise. Gravity, the only law that never stops whispering, kept its invitation simple. Come closer. Nothing about these beginnings was flash. The universe learned to build the way a child learns to balance, tiny steps, small corrections, one wobble at a time. Around each invisible hill, a slow spin emerged, not because anything spun it by hand, but because unevenness has a habit of becoming motion. That motion flattened the gas into a broad, pale disk, the faintest sketch of a future city. If you could have stood there, if there meant anything yet, you wouldn't have heard a sound. You'd have felt a certainty. In the silent darkness, scaffolds cut the first drafts of light. The plan was simple, and it would work. Gather, cool, tighten, repeat. Out of patience came structure. Out of structure would come flame. And out of flame, the ingredients for everything else. Light arrived like flint in a cave, brief, brilliant, and suddenly everything was different. Deep inside the densest knots of gas, pressure clenched until atoms forgot their gentle habits and fused. The first stars woke enormous and blue sprinters rather than marathoners. They carved tunnels through the leftover fog, their glare scouring cavities, their winds piling shells and ridges as if they'd invented weather. Inside their cores, the simplest elements were hammered into heavier ones, changing the local recipe forever. Carbon for skeletons that might one day breathe, oxygen for oceans that might one day wave, iron for cores that might one day anchor world. When those giants died, they did not vanish politely. They detonated, a punctuation so loud it restructured the paragraph. Shock waves ran through the surrounding gas, squeezing new clouds into readiness even as the debris seeded them with metals and dust. This was the first cycle and the most important lesson. Make, spend, enrich, try again. Starbirth wasn't a factory line with perfect timing. It was a kitchen where storms of ingredients kept arriving, where steam and smoke were mess and miracle at once. The darkness receded by degrees, not like a curtain, but like dawn through fog, patches bright, patches dim, complex and alive. Between bursts, the gas cooled and settled. In bursts, it thickened and lit. You could already see the outlines of a larger order, as if someone had sketched a circle and the dots were beginning to understand they belonged on a curve. None of this was quick, and that saved it. Had it gone faster, the first lights would have used up their world and gone dark. Instead, they were generous teachers who made mistakes loudly and left better tools behind. Spin took hold the way a lullaby calms a room. The gathering cloud flattened as it turned, and lanes of traffic appeared, spiral patterns that were less bridges and more songs moving through the disk. Where the song passed, gas felt a nudge, pressure rose, and clouds agreed to collapse. Where the song had just been, newborn clusters drifted away, still blue, still loud. like applause following musicians off a stage. The arms sharpened and then tufted, changed with the weather, adjusted to supply. They were organizers, not ornaments. In their company, the galaxy in the making learned timing. Don't light everywhere at once. Focus, then rest. Harvest where the squeeze is kind and leave other fields to ripen. Meanwhile, an invisible halo, dark matter again, quiet and faithful, cupped the whole enterprise, keeping speeds from flinging stars into the void, holding the city together while it whirled. The center thickened, swelling into a bulge where orbits ran tight, and the average star looked older, redder, softer in voice. Out along the rim, new gas arrived in thin, cold streams, extending the disk in pale ribbons, giving the outskirts a chance to shine in their own time. Dust lanes braided across the arms like dark rivers, not empty at all, but packed with cool, patient promise. The galaxy's face, if you could have seen it then, would look like a map of neighborhoods in conversation, bright patches where the song pressed hardest, quieter blocks between, and a downtown learning its own rules. Above the plain, a few pioneers rose and fell, early hints of a thicker layer that remembered the rowdier youth. But mostly the city settled into its breathing, a rhythm of traffic and rest. It had found a way to build without breaking its. At the very heart where orbits crowded like beads on a wire, a darker seed learned to eat. It may have begun as a single collapsed giant or as a flock of smaller remnants that found each other and married their shadows, or perhaps as gas that never learned to shine, falling straight into secrecy. However it started, once the seed tasted a steady stream, it became an engine. As gas spiraled inward, it heated until it glowed with terrible efficiency, and some of that fury shot out in narrow jets, straight as spears, punching through the halo like hot nails through wax. The engine's light sometimes outshone the whole galaxy, a brief crown thrown over the city's head, and yet, counterintuitively, that rage helped. It stirred the inner air, pushed back excess, kept the pantry from collapsing entirely into the center. Too much food at once, and the core would have gorged, starving the arms. Too little and the city would have gone dim. The engine's tantrums balanced the ledger, carving chimneys that later let hot breath escape and cool rain return. After each flare, the center dimmed to embers, letting circlets of new stars settle around it like necklaces. Those rings were neat, traffic slowed there by the arithmetic of orbits, pressure rose, and clusters queued bar. If one had grown, served as a conveyor, sliding gas along straight lanes to feed the rings and then stepping politely aside. In this way, the hidden heart became a stern but helpful conductor. It did not run the entire symphony, but when it raised its baton, sections quieted or swelled and the piece held together. The lesson was harsh but generous. Even hunger can be harnessed. Neighbors arrived as stories with legs. Small galaxies drifted in along the same filaments that fed the disk. Faint smudges at first, then undeniable. Some skimmed past, stretching tides into long, pale tails that wrote their names across the halo. Others looped close and closer still, losing a little mass on each pass. Stars peeled like petals, gas poured like silk, until they surrendered altogether and became part of the host. Those stars didn't vanish. They settled into the halo as ghostly streams, receipts you could read if you knew where to look. Their gas slipped into the outskirts and bled inward, a quiet inheritance that brightened lanes years later. Now and then, a heavier companion came too close, and the city danced a clumsy waltz. Disks, klutz, arms warped, bursts of starbirth flickered like thunderstorms. Sometimes the aftermath was orderly, a new disk laid gently over the old bones. Other times the mess erased the old spiral and left behind a rounded elder with stars on random orbits, its calm face hiding a dramatic past. Either way, growth continued. The halo thickened with memories. The bar learned new steps or unlearned old ones. Rings appeared, shifted, faded. Every encounter left a fingerprint, a lopsided glow, a ripple in star speeds, a spur along an arm where pressure had once been higher. In a calmer era, you could still find those marks and trace them with a fingertip, like the grain in wood. The galaxy grew not only by eating gas, but by adopting kin, and that adoption rewrote little parts of its personality without undoing who it was trying to become. When the neighborhood calmed, the city turned inward and practiced craft. A bar of stars and gas thickened across the center like a timber bracing an old roof. It wasn't a decoration, it was a tool. The bar gathered gas from the inner arms and slid it toward the core in steady streams, feeding rings that formed where orbits liked to linger. These rings shone with different tempers. A narrow inner circlet sparkled with impatient clusters, loud in youth and generous with wind. A broader ring, farther out, hummed with steadier families, their glow longer lived, their weather kinder. The bar itself waxed and waned, sometimes straight and strong, sometimes softer, even absent for a while. Each state left marks, a peanut-shaped glow in the bulge when it flexed hard, a lamp-like bulge when it rested. Spiral arms worked as section leaders, shepherding clouds toward the cues and compressing them with friendly firmness. Dust drew guidelines, dark veils tracing lanes where future clusters would gather, shading gas long enough for molecules to keep their bonds. Superbubble chimneys, blown by earlier festivals, rose and cooled and rained back in fine mist, precisely where it helped most. Nothing about this era was dramatic, and that was the point. The city had finally learned how to make prosperity quiet, move fuel without panicking the pantry, light rooms without tripping breakers, keep vents open, label the shelves. The ledger checked often showed fewer wasteful bursts and more steady winds. If the galaxy could have posted a sign to itself, it would have read, "Build, breathe, balance, begin again." Dust deserved its own hymn. Forged in the gentle breaths of red giants and in the explosive farewells of massive stars, grains drifted like soot and settled like snow. They soaked up harsh starlight and released it softly, the way a curtain tames a hot afternoon. In their shade, molecules could form and survive, hydrogen pairing off, carbon spinning chains, oxygen finding partners, and that cooling unlocked collapse. Dense clouds tore into filaments, filaments knotted into cores, cores folded until the oldest trick in the universe happened again: darkness lit. From the outside, dust looked like absence, dark lanes slicing across bright arms, and truth, those lanes were crowded boulevards, nurseries bustling with turbulence, braided like hair. Radiation pushed dust one way, magnetic threads tugged another, gravity kept count and declared when the vote was final. Fresh stars then pushed back, winds clearing bubbles, light etching cavities, and dust answered with patience, sliding, clumping, reforming in the envelopes of calmer elders. Over and over, the city learned to reuse what it had made, as if budget and beauty agreed for once. Much of that dust would never see a planet's surface or a ring's glitter. It would spend its days doing the quiet work of shade and temperature, the small adjustments that make big differences. If you wanted a map to where the next generation would appear, you could do worse than follow the dart. It hid nothing. It promised everything. It was the nearest thing to a roadmap the galaxy ever wrote. Stars were not statues. Patterns nudged their orbits the way waves move leaves, and over ages they migrated, trading a little speed for a new address, a little distance for a different neighborhood. A sun born in the bright inner lanes might wander to quieter suburbs where nights were longer and tempers cooler, An elder from the outskirts might drift inward, bringing leaner chemistry to richer street. This mixing softened gradients without erasing them, turning the disk into conversation rather than a hierarchy. Above the thin, crisp plain, a thicker layer remembered the rowdier youth. Stars with warmer motions, rounder roots, scars from old turbulent. Now and then a tight cluster resisted dissolution, stubborn as a knot in rope. Each pass through the inner lanes shook a few members free, leaving faint threads behind, words in cursive for anyone patient enough to read them. Planets traveled with their suns, whole archives on the move. A world formed under modest metals might end up swimming in neighborhoods that encouraged oceans and air. Another born with riches might wander to leaner edges and keep its wealth safe in slower company. Nothing stood still except the rules that allowed motion. The arms kept time, the bar rearranged traffic when needed. The halo's invisible hands steadied the floor. Migration acted like circulation in a body, keeping the disk healthy, distributing freshness and fatigue so no single region hoarded either. In the wake of mixing, clouds found new flavors and cooled more efficiently. And so the story kept itself supple. Lean years arrived like a library after closing, quiet, orderly, no drama in the voice. Inflow from the web thinned, the circumgalactic sea above the disk went smooth and still. Deliveries slowed to careful parcels. The bar kept its roots, but the inner ring dimmed to a polite glow, and the arms turned their festivals into small gatherings. The city answered with craft. Dust thickened its veils to help scraps cool into seriousness. Old chimneys served as vents, carrying hot breath up to the halo, where it would linger, age, and condense. The core stayed courteous, refusing big meals and content with sips, because tantrums would only waste what little remained. Superb bubbles, once loud, became polite weather, their rims curling just enough to plant new clusters along the edges. Even a stray ribbon from a long-forgotten neighbor was signed for, unpacked and shelved with gratitude. None of this felt like decline. It felt like competence. The galaxy learned thrift without panic, patience without boredom. Gradients softened further. Migration kept the neighborhoods in conversational distance. The ledger read modest debits and tiny credits, but in neat handwriting. The most important thing about quiet seasons is that they don't last if you treat them well. By keeping vents clear, routes practiced, shade ready, and tempers even, the city made itself a place where new generosity would have somewhere sensible to land. When generosity returned, it did not shout. Cool rain condensed along the old filaments in the halo and slipped down to the arms that had been waiting with outstretched hands. The inner ring kindled like a bracelet rediscovered in a drawer. The outer lanes stitched clusters in steady chains, no wildfires, just many small hearths. The chimneys already stood open to carry away heat. Dust was draped exactly where shade would help most. The bar had not forgotten its choreography. The core tasted new meals and kept good manners, short flares, long naps. So the pantry stayed stocked for more than a single binge. Metals, products of older days, spiced the fresh gas and made cooling easier, so clouds folded without fuss. Clusters hatched in the right mix, a few showy giants to stir the air, many steady citizens to light the streets for ages. Migration resumed its gentle blending. Gradients remained legible but kind. The warp at the rim nodded softly, a reminder that supply lines rarely arrived perfectly aligned. The halo steadied the floor. Satellites tugged without mischief. Where old holes remained from previous storms, new pressure curled their rims and planted stars like stitches in a quilt. The ledger smiled. Deliveries matched needs, waste ran low. If you wanted to hear the music of a mature galaxy, this was it. A rhythm you could hum while doing your work, crescendos brief and placed well, rests respected, the tempo kept by gravity's metronome and sung by a choir of light that knew how to breathe together. A misaligned ribbon arrived like a letter from a distant cousin who still remembered the old neighborhood. It slipped in at an angle the inner lanes did not share, and, with the politest insistence, deepened the warp at the rim. The outskirts rippled like a drum skin after a careful tap, up, down, then up again, the pattern drifting inward as waves of compression and release. Along those crests, clouds found just enough squeeze to commit, and blue villages lit in scalloped arcs that traced the passage of the wrinkle. Dust followed the ridges, thickening into veils that cooled the air behind the wave, so the newborns were not tossed into heat the moment they arrived. The bar, unbothered, kept its deliveries. The inner rings glowed with their usual etiquette. Above, the circumgalactic sea noticed the wrinkles and condensed a little more readily along them, returning rain that matched the new geometry. It felt less like disruption than like calligraphy. New strokes added to a script the city already knew how to read. Migrant stars rode the vertical sway and carried chemistry between floors, blending flavors in ways the ledger counted as quiet gains. When the ribbon had given what it could, it thinned into transparency and joined the general medium, its name erased, but its gifts lodged in pockets of starlight that would outlast memory. The warp, left to its slower procession, relaxed a notch with each passing season. What remained was character, an edge with a story in its curve, and in that curve a record of how the galaxy preferred to answer surprises, not by stiffening, not by ignoring, but by folding the new line into a paragraph that already flowed. Building continued, now with a slight lilt, like a song that learned a harmony and kept it. The road toward the cosmic city grew busier, and our spiral found itself grazing the suburbs of a cluster too massive to ignore. The air between galaxies there was hot and thin, a headwind that tugged at gas in the outskirts. As the galaxy slipped through, the wind caught loose filaments and drew them out into pale, shimmering tails, bright with knots where pressure spiked. It was stripping, yes, but also sewing. The very force that peeled gas away compressed what remained, sparking strings of starbirth along the lee side. The bar felt the tension and leaned inward, routing deliveries to rings that sheltered behind the bulge. The core stayed courteous, content with small courses rather than a feast that might have blown back harsher weather. Satellites buzzed like commuters, their tugs brief but numerous, jostling arms into asymmetries that the disk learned to carry with a shrug. The halo did its quiet best, deepening the potential well so the city did not lose more than it could afford. In the cluster's glow, round elders drifted past galaxies whose arms had long ago fossilized, while newer spirals, luckier in their orbits, kept their fuel lines and their blue-laced lanes. Our galaxy skimmed the outskirts, suffering ruffled edges and a tail that looked from afar like a comet's. That tail would fade, its stars would be adopted by the cluster's shared halo, its gas would either rain back later or help paint someone else's rim. Through it all, the ledger stayed practical. Some loss, some gain, a lesson in crosswinds. When the galaxy finally swung out of the densest air, it carried new rings brightened by pressure, arms slightly rephrased, and a memory of how to hold shape while giving up what couldn't be kept, not defeat. Practice. Back in calmer lanes, the city tried on new architecture. The bar, once a stiff beam, grew boxy in the core, then buckled gently, leaving a peanut-shaped glow that confessed the stress it had endured. That buckle didn't break anything. It rearranged orbits into families that supported a more stable brace. Gas, obedient to the new geometry, found fresh cues. An inner ring tightened and sparkled. A broader ring expanded and hummed, and between them a gap widened, a silent aisle where orbits chose steadiness. by staying apart. The core tasted occasional parcels with polite flares that cleared vents and kept the pantry sensible. When the bar tired, it softened. Spiral arms took the lead, writing with a looser hand, tufting into many small lanes that stitched the disc like quilting. Later the bar reformed, not as an edict but as a solution the mass itself preferred, efficient routes returning because they solved the city's traffic cleanly. Each cycle left fossils. The peanuts, silhouette, star streams from dissolved circlets, dust rings faintly darker than their surroundings, like fingerprints on polished wood. None of this required drama. Secular work, they might have called it, if galaxies kept meeting minutes, slow rebalancing by internal rules, with the halo's steady hand and the circumgalactic sea's patient breath as constant background. Amid these rearrangements, clusters of intermediate age flourished, too old to shout, too young to dim, bridges between episodes, their light smoothing the face into continuity. The ledger approved, deliveries matched cues, vents stayed open, waste ran low. Practice had become habit architecture. When the next nudge came, an offbeat whisper from a passing dwarf, a slightly misaligned drizzle, the city felt ready, not because it could predict specifics, but because it had built a body that accommodated change without mistaking it for catastrophe. Chemistry deepened like flavor in a pot that's been simmering all day. Metals from elder stars salted the gas, dust thickened into better shade, cooling became quicker, where ingredients ran rich. As a result, the map of star birth shifted. The inner lanes, generous with heavy elements, favored smaller, steadier suns that would light rooms for ages and host patient disks where worlds could keep their air. Farther out, where the mix was leaner, burst ran hotter and briefer, beautiful blue festivals that faded to amber sooner. Winds carried richness outward, inflow brought plain breath inward. Fountains ferried tastes between floors, their updrafts and rainfalls balancing the stew without homogenizing it. Gradients survived, softened, but legible. A cloud could feel the difference. Collapse came easier near downtown, slower toward the rim, unless a spiral shock, a ring's cue, or a passing ribbon tipped the decision. Planets mirrored preference around suns in tranquil corridors between arms, disks settled into order, rings, gaps, clumps, until collisions gentled from shatters to mergers and cores grew. On colder outskirts, ice wrote paler architectures, grand but fragile. Migration shuffled the deck, letting a world born under modest metals wander into neighborhoods with better prospects and vice versa. The bar kept feeding the inner circlets, supernova gardeners trimmed without uprooting. The core's discipline ensured no single course dominated the menu. Over time, the city's light reddened slightly, not from decline, but from maturity. Longer-lived stars contributing more to the chorus. The young still sang, just a bit more softly, their solos better played. Anyone tracing the spectrum would read the biography easily. Here a bluer stanza from a recent drizzle, there a warmer chapter testifying to a quiet century of thrift. The recipe kept revising itself in the same kitchen. Better stock, wiser fire. The halo held a library of long sentences written in thin ink. Streams, leftovers of old adoptions, looped in pale cursive around the city, each telling where a donor arrived, how it circled, when it gave in. Globular clusters served as punctuation marks, ancient and compact, dotting clauses that began before the bar learned its current manners. Every so often, a new stream unraveled from a dissolving companion, its stars at first a bright ribbon, then a fray, then a haze. From the disk, where traffic and weather demanded attention, these scripts looked distant, but their gravity hummed in the background, tugging the outskirts into weak asymmetries, whispering to the warp, occasionally nudging a ribbon of gas toward a ring that needed replenishment. Archaeology was everywhere for anyone who cared to read, a faint overdensity above the plane marking a long-gone plunge, a shell-like ripple in star speeds from a pericenter pass, a chemically odd flock bearing the accent of a foreign birthplace. Such relics weren't clutter, they were context. They explained why one arm carried a subtle spur, why another lane leaned warmer than its mirror, why the halo's profile wore a slight shoulder rather than a perfect slope. The city's biography included these margins not as footnotes, but as chapters with quieter stakes. In calm seasons, when rings ran steadily and the core slept, attention could widen enough to appreciate the halo's slow conversations. Out there, the circumgalactic sea mingled with these streams, seeding filaments along their paths so that rain tended to fall where memory already lived. The ledger, if it had a poetic streak, might have written, "History is a weather pattern. What came before shapes where the next cloud cools, and where the next cloud cools tells the future what to remember." A guest arrived with a ghostly face, a diffuse companion, big in span, but light in stars, like lace hung on a frame. It drifted past the rim and almost reluctantly began to unravel. Tides plucked at it, peeling gauze into twin tails that trailed in mirrored arcs. The drama was subtle, the surface brightness low, but along those tails, pressure stitched small knots that brightened into starry beads. Some would become self-possessed dwarfs. Others would dissolve and sprinkle their light into the halo's general glow. Meanwhile, inside the disk, the encounter registered as a soft asymmetry. One arm tightened its curve, the opposite loosened into patches. The bar adjusted its deliveries, prioritizing the slack side to keep the face from listing. The core remained a polite spectator. Above, the circumgalactic sea traced the unraveling with condensing threads, adding a whisper of rain that fed the beads along the tails. For a while, the scene resembled a slow fireworks show performed for an audience with patient eyes. In the aftermath, the galaxy kept souvenirs, a faint shelf in the outskirts where the lace had skimmed, a slightly thicker halo where the gauze blended, a handful of newly minted companions on fragile orbits. None of it changed the city's intentions. If anything, it reinforced them. Encounters could be absorbed without rewiring the house, provided the house remembered how to flex and breathe. The ledger noted the gifts, metals, and gas, a few long-lived clusters born in the tails, and the costs, mild heating of the rim, temporary lopsidedness, a little extra work for the bar, balanced. On the whole, kindness, even. Not every guest breaks the furniture. Some leave poems and a draft through an open window that makes the curtains dance. The disk learned to breathe in layers. A minor merger, not much heavier than a rumor, passed through at a tilt and set the stars bobbing. For seasons, the plane rippled up on one side, down on the other, like a pond remembering a step. Vertical waves marched inward and outward, their amplitudes fading as the city's self-gravity damped them. The younger, thinner layer responded with a graceful sway. The older, thicker sheet nodded more stiffly, its memory shaped by earlier rough weather. Gas, sensitive to every pressure change, pulled along the compressions and thinned along the rarefactions, tracing the waves' crests with faint enhancements in starbirth. Dust veils followed suit, thickening where shade would help, thinning where light could pass. The bar timed its deliveries to meet compressions, and rings, always practical, adjusted their radii by a whisper to catch the moving sweet spots. Above, the circumgalactic sea smoothed the disturbance by offering rain preferentially where the wave raised the knee. The halo absorbed momentum like a generous floor. By the time the bobbing dwindled to habit, The disk had quietly thickened by a sliver, trading a little crispness for a little resilience. In the ledger, the episode counted as maintenance, small heating compensated by broader stability, modest a star birth sparked in the right places, a reminder that even tiny visitors can teach posture. Afterward, the arms resumed their writing with steady strokes. If you looked closely, you could still see the faint corrugation, a gentle corrugated roof under starlight, evidence that the city's body keeps traces of every lesson it survives. That's not scarred structure. The galaxy kept building with the same patience, now with a breath that held a slow, almost musical rise and fall, like someone who's learned to pace their work over a long, good life. One day, a small companion aimed truer than most and passed close to the center, nearly head-on. It didn't have the mass to overturn the city, but it launched a circular wave that rippled outward through the disk, a bright ring sweeping like dawn along a coastline. Where the wavefront passed, gas compressed sharply. Clusters ignited in a near-continuous necklace that chased the expanding circle. Behind the front, the disk looked momentarily washed, emptier of gas, lighter in dust, before traffic and fountains refilled it. The bar paused, then resumed, coordinating with the new geometry so its deliveries met the ring cleanly. The core, alerted by the sudden rearrangement, flared briefly, an ember blown on, then dimmed, letting vents carry heat into the circumgalactic sea where it would become tomorrow's drizzle. The ring broadened as it traveled, its edge feathering into arcs that linked with spiral arms, silently handing off their beaded clusters to the longer lanes. After a while, the wave weakened, and the necklace blurred into patches, then into the ordinary pattern of star-forming lanes. Souvenir dust rims lingered, faint outlines of the ring's path, along with a mild lopsidedness where the companion had departed. In the halo, a new stream began, the remnant of the intruder stretched into a commuter line that would circle for ages. The ledger tallied the event as a successful festival, a well-timed burst that didn't raid the pantry, a temporary geometry that sharpened the city's sense of timing, an afterglow of clusters that would age gracefully into the background. Not every headline needs a revolution. Sometimes a ring is enough, a clean note sung in full voice, sustained, and then folded back into the harmony without fuss. Gradually, the pantry began to lean toward austerity again, not from catastrophe, but from arithmetic. Starbirth, even careful, consumes fuel, inflows wander. The circumgalactic sea can only condense so fast. The galaxy answered with the wisdom of experience, the bulge, grown by years of quiet deliveries and calm mergers, stabilized the inner lanes, making clouds think twice before collapsing. Arms wrote in softer strokes, rings toned down their sparkle to a steady hum. The core kept to sips and catnaps. Winds elevated less gas. Fountains shortened their loops. Yet star formation did not cease. It focused. Nurseries favored corridors with the best mix of shade, pressure, and metals. Elsewhere, gas lingered in a poised state, ready but not rushed. This restraint wasn't surrender, it was strategy, morphological calm, turning into a kind of quenching that saved fuel without freezing the city's pulse. Migration continued to circulate chemistry, dust maintained its cool veils, satellites still donated thin ribbons that the outskirts gratefully received. Here and there a modest rejuvenation occurred when a passerby's tail grazed the rim, or when the halo's filaments briefly fattened with fresh condensate. Those events lit edges, refreshed rings, and reminded the ledger that the long game matters more than any single quarter. The face reddened a shade, older stars contributing more song, but blue notes remained, placed with taste rather than urgency. The galaxy entered a posture you might call sustainable maturity, less about conquest, more about curation, less about blaze, more about glow. From a distance it looked serene. Up close it felt like competent systems maintained, vents clear, shelves labeled, a workshop where the lights still burned late, but nobody wasted screw. In a quiet mid-arm neighborhood, a patient star gathered worlds, and one of those worlds learned the trick of seas and weather and stories. The galaxy did not notice. It seldom notices its smallest poem, but the neighborhood benefited from the city's larger habits. A lane between arms where shocks were mild, a dust-to-gas ratio that cooled disks without choking them, a metallicity that allowed rock and water to exist in friendly balance. Supernova had trimmed the surroundings long ago, leaving a porous medium where light could pass and molecules could hide. The bar's cadence meant occasional deliveries of fresh, slightly enriched gas to keep the corridor lively without chaos. Migration had not hauled the star far from its temperate orbit, and the warp's nod was a distant sway, more scenery than weather. In that steadiness, orbits stabilized, climates found rhythm, chemistry stretched into long, improbable sentences. Much later, eyes opened under a sky striped by the faint blur of the galaxy's own arms. Those eyes looked up and tried to guess the city's biography from a single vantage. They could not see the halo's handwriting, or the bar's flex, or the chimney's lifting breath to the circumgalactic sea. Yet, by listening to the light, by weighing dust with color and motion with tiny shifts, they began to reconstruct the story the galaxy had been telling with its whole body. Their questions were small and enormous. Why spirals? Why rings? Why do streams curve where they do? The galaxy, for its part, kept building, because that is what it knows how to do. If it could answer, it might say, I learned balance by surviving imbalance. I make light the way forests make shade with patience and cycles. Keep asking, I'll keep singing. The eyes that opened under that striped sky built better ears for light. They learned to weigh dust from its glow, to read the drift of stars from tiny shifts, to trace invisible rivers of gas by the faintest whispers at long wavelengths. In their maps, the galaxy looked like a living weather report, spiral lanes as pressure fronts, rings as patient cues, chimneys as thermal vents into the high outskirts. They watched supernovae go off like flashbulbs and then fade, leaving bubbles that rose and cooled. They noticed the dark lanes were not emptiness, but scaffolds where the next generation would prefer to form. They even sensed the hidden conductor at the heart, not by seeing it, but by the way stars near the center moved a little too quickly, by the narrow jets that sometimes lit the halo with ghostly beams. None of these discoveries changed the galaxy, they changed the listeners. The City of Light did what it had always done: gather, cool, kindle, regulate, repeat. But now, every routine became a revelation. A ring brightened and dimmed and was measured. A bar flexed and relaxed and was charted. A satellite grazed the rim and left a stream that was followed across seasons. The galaxy tolerated the scrutiny with the equanimity of an ocean observed from a cliff. It kept breathing, it kept building, and because the listeners were patient, they began to see the biography hiding in plain starlight, how the face had thickened in youth, how the arms had sharpened in middle age, how the pantry had learned thrift and then grace. The maps grew richer, the questions kinder, and the answers more like stories than verdicts. The galaxy did not applaud. It simply offered another dawn, another ring of blue beating along an arm, another reason to keep the instruments warm. There came an era when the bar loosened its grip, not in surrender, but in generosity. It had hauled for ages, feeding inner rings, cueing circlets, but the mass distribution changed and the brace relaxed. In its gentler mood, spiral arms took the lead, and the central bulge wore a softer lamp-like glow. Rings thinned halos of light rather than blazing bracelets. Lanes broadened, shocks softened. Starbirth did not vanish. It redistributed, spreading like a low fire through well-spaced brush rather than a concentrated blaze. Dust veils adjusted, less like drapes and more like gauze, letting warmth escape without letting molecules be scalded. The core, free from heavy deliveries, dozed with courtesy, waking only to take a sip when a cloud found its way in with undue enthusiasm. This ease taught a quiet lesson, that a galaxy can hold shape without leaning on a single tool. Structures are agreements, not decrees. The halo continued its silent stewardship, nudging the outskirts into a mild warp that precessed like a slow thought. The circumgalactic sea above the disk mirrored the change, condensing rain in broader sheets rather than narrow streams, so the outer lanes felt included. Migrant stars, never content to keep one address, blurred gradients a little more. Clusters of intermediate age stitched continuity between episodes. In such times, the face looked placid to a casual glance, but the ledger rejoiced. Fewer extremes, less waste, more rooms lit for longer. If you could read the city's mood, it would sound like the contented clink of a workshop at noon. Tools in use, vents open, shelves tidy, hands unhurried and sure. The bar would return, stronger or different, when mass and motion asked for it again. For now, the lesson was that balance can be a moving target and still be balance. A faint, gas-rich dwarf arrived like rain on a parched field. It didn't hit head-on or blaze. It slid alongside its own thread, feeding into the rim. The outskirts brightened first, a ring of beads igniting where pressure crested. Then the glow marched inward as spiral shocks welcomed the new supply. What the dwarf lacked in stars, it made up in fuel, and the disk responded with a measured festival. No stampede, just steady hatching along lanes that had been waiting with patient dust and practiced vents. The bar, sensing opportunity, began to reassert itself, a timber tightening across the center, not to hoard, but to route. Inner rings revived. Circlets refilled like cisterns after a long dry season. The core tasted the richer air and offered a brief polite flare, carving a few fresh chimneys for heat to escape. Above, the circumgalactic sea thickened along the merger's wake, preparing more drizzle where it would be wanted. Even the halo seemed to hum, its steady gravity greeting the new mass as an addition to the family ledger. Tidal tales thin, almost shy, unwound from the dwarf, chalk lines in the dark that would disperse into the general glow. Some beads along those tails would live on as tiny independent companions. Most would dissolve and donate their stars to the halo's long sentences. The disk in turn felt refreshed rather than disrupted. It had the muscle memory for this shade. The gas, fold it gently, light what's ready, rest what isn't, and keep the vents clear. The face took on a younger blush without losing its practiced calm. In the maps of the listeners below, new constellations of blue appeared along the rim, testimonies to the power of a polite arrival. Not all growth needs fireworks. Sometimes a gift is a long drink of water. Seasons of prosperity revealed details that scarcity hides. With steady deliveries, the arms sharpened their handwriting, drawing crisp lanes where clouds queued predictably. Rings acted like round marketplaces where traffic flowed without jams, each stall a cluster at a different age, each alley a dust lane guiding newcomers to their place. Super bubbles rose and merged with grace, carving skylights that vented heat without tearing the roof. The warp at the rim nodded its slow ascent, shaking out small waves that lit scalloped arcs along the edge and then quieted. Migration continued its gentle blend, smearing the chemistry just enough to keep gradients kind. And in the midst of this competence, the galaxy's colors shifted imperceptibly. Blue notes still rang, but the chorus leaned warmer as long-lived stars contributed more of the melody. That wasn't decline, it was maturity. The face of a city whose lights burn late because it knows how to budget electricity. The core played its part like a disciplined hearth, flaring for maintenance, not spectacle. So the pantry remained stocked. The circumgalactic sea learned the route so well that its rain fell with uncanny timing, meeting needs like a well-run delivery service. Out in the halo, streams faded into haze, their histories still readable but less insistent. New faint ribbons appeared where small donors lofted their last gifts. Reminders that the family kept growing in modest ways. To the listeners below, the galaxy looked both predictable and alive. A place where forecasts meant something, where surprises were folded into practices rather than becoming crises. If they had put words to it, they might have called it stewardship, a fragile balance between ambition and restraint. The ledger called it solvency with style, but restraint invites the universe to test it. A near-equal bright spun, opinionated, drifted into range, its halo whispering first, its tide speaking next, its arms reaching last. The duet began slowly, a long courtship of loops and inclinations, each pass carving deeper tales, each tide unspooling brighter plumes. Discs tilted, bars wrestled, rings warped into ovals, and then into crescent. Where gas collided, pressure spiked and starbirth roared, citywide thunderstorms lighting neighborhoods too long quiet. The cores tasted lavish courses and answered with jets and heat that drilled chimneys into the circumgalactic sea. For a while, chaos wore a crown, the ledger filled with both windfall and waste. Clusters hatched in profusion, gas heated and fled, dust burned and was reborn in calmer envelopes. Tidal tales stretched for what seemed forever, letters scrawled in light that even distant neighbors could read. In the thick of it, identity blurred. Which arm belonged to whom? Which ring was original? Which bar led and which followed? And yet, beneath the tumult, the same rules held. Gravity counted. Vents mattered. Shade had. Patience still worked. When the orbits finally spent their momentum and the hearts drew near enough to marry, the city faced an accounting. If enough gas remained cool and unshredded, a new disk could be laid atop the ruins, spirals redrafted over the palimpsest of bright boxy bones. If not, stars would settle into random orbits, making a smooth-faced elder whose calm hid a glorious past. Either way, nothing of value was lost. It was rearranged. The biography would turn a loud page and continue in a new chapter's voice. In this telling, gas kept its nerve. Though battered and heated, though lofted and compressed, enough of it cooled in the aftermath to try again. The merged core, heavier now but exhausted, dozed, vents gaped open like skylights after a storm. The circumgalactic sea condensed along scars, sending down veils of rain exactly where the rebuilding needed to begin. Dust, reborn in the envelopes of elderly stars and the embers of detonations, thickened into lanes that shaded the recovered gas. A fresh bar rose from the commotion, not as a relic, but as a solution, a brace that made sense for the mass at hand. Rings returned like habits, first tentative, then steady, marking the places where orbits cooperated. Spiral arms, at first ragged, found their rhythm and began to write again, crisp in new ink. The face was not what it had been, it was what it had learned. The bulge wore a boxier glow, a fossil of the tussle. The halo, richer with streams, wore the marriage's signatures in pale cursive. In the outskirts, long tails diluted into the general haze, seeding faint companions that would orbit as polite witnesses to the event. The listeners below watched the Renaissance with awe. They traced the new lanes, mapped the chimneys, charted the beads of blue that flared along fresh shocks. They saw continuity, wearing the mask of change, and understood the truism that only felt trite before they could test it. Galaxies are not things, but processes. The ledger, for its part, showed a city back in business, stock reorganized, shelves relabeled, routes updated, lights a second youth, not a repetition but a rhyme. As the wider cosmos aged, deliveries from the web grew thinner. Filaments themselves were not as generous. The circumgalactic sea's fountains shortened. Satellites arrived with less to give. The galaxy, practiced at thrift, leaned into curation, rings still lit, but more like pearl necklaces worn for special evenings than workaday bracelets. Arms still wrote, but the handwriting softened, favoring legibility over flourish. The core's courtesy deepened into habit, brief flares for ventilation, long stretches of embered calm, dust maintained its quiet governance. But new grains arrived more slowly, so lanes looked a shade lighter, their veils thinner. Star birth shifted to the best intersections of shade, pressure, and chemistry. Elsewhere, gas hovered in poised refusal, ready if nudged, unwilling to rush. Migration kept the disk mixed. Gradient stayed readable but gentle. The warp nodded slowly as ever. A quiet quenching spread from the inner lanes outward, not a guillotine but a soft hand on the shoulder suggesting rest. The face reddened with the glow of elders. Blue still appeared in tasteful punctuation where chance conspired. The halo's library lengthened with faint new streams, each shorter than the last. To the listeners below, now many patient and wise, the galaxy looked serene like a city that had made peace with nights that begin earlier. They did not mistake serenity for death. They knew the pantry was not empty, only careful. They learned to find excitement in the subtleties, a ring tightening by a whisper, a plume of rain returning after a modest flare, a dwarf's shy donation lighting the rim like a smile. The ledger called it late solvency, bills paid, tools oiled, stories still told. With time, the chorus of elders grew dominant. Red giants puffed and shed, writing glowing shells that faded into the general light. Compact remnants accumulated like punctuation, white embers, rare neutron gems, black seeds here and there. Globulars, those tenacious archivists, continued their high loops, losing a few members at each passage and yet persisting. Amber hearths scattered through the halo. The dust economy slowed but never stopped. Grains formed in stellar envelopes and survived the gentler weather, settling into lanes that still shaded the occasional nursery. Supernovae became less frequent but no less important, each one a gardener's last vigorous turn of the soil, trimming, stirring, making room, then letting quiet return. The circumgalactic sea held on to its role, thinner but meaningful, condensing rain in response to chimneys that the core opened with metronomic discipline. Down in the mid-disk, planets aged and systems stabilized. A few worlds endured long enough to see constellations shift by their own migration, to witness rings brighten and dim across eras. The galaxy's face, now warmer, still showed pattern, faint spirals, polite rings, a bar that sometimes flexed more for posture than for hauling. In the listeners' maps, subtle flows replaced fireworks as the subject of fascination. They found beauty in gradients, in the way metallicity braided with age, in the way vertical ripples remembered long ago visitors. They understood that becoming is not only for youth. Even in a slower century, the city practiced its arts, ventilation, shading, routing, restraint. The ledger's margins filled with notes in a small, neat hand, maintenance logged, minor gifts accepted, quiet wins appreciated. Every story deserves a wider frame. Across the great web, other cradles had learned the same grammar in different dialects. Some, battered early by crowding, wore smooth, round faces, elder cities whose lights were steady and whose histories read like epics condensed into calm. Others, out in voids where solitude ruled, kept their blue lanes deep into late times, their arms still crisp, their rings still loud. There were dwarfs like lace, giants like domes, needles and wheels, ragged books of stacked episodes, and saints of symmetry that looked carved rather than grown. Our galaxy, never truly ours but easy to love, was one voice in this choir, shaped by neighbors, by luck, by timing, by simple rules applied with endless patience. How galaxies are born, the listeners decided, was less a single event than a lifeway scaffolds, inviting fall, fall inviting fire, fire inviting feedback, feedback inviting balance, balance inviting memory, memory inviting renewal. When their instruments cooled for the last time each night, they stepped outside and looked up at the soft smear that was their city's face. It had changed since their ancestors first named it. It would change after they were gone. That did not lessen its meaning. If anything, it increased it, because meaning attached not to permanence, but to pattern. The way the light kept its promises, the way the darkness made room for beginnings, the way both together taught patience as the oldest art. And so the story kept going, as all good stories do, by making room for another chapter, and by leaving in its margins just enough silence for new questions to begin. The listeners built calendars from light. They learned to date a cluster by the hue of its brightest members, to age a stream by how widely it had fanned across the halo, to time a ring by the sizes of the beads that still burned blue within it. In their archives, a patient spiral arm became a decade, a bar cycle a century, a major merger an era that reset not years but assumptions. Forecasts follow. A dwarf on a long, lopsided loop would graze the rim in 3 city seasons. The warp's nod would send a compression through the outskirts, 2 ring rotations from now. The core's ember would likely flare when deliveries reached a threshold the bar was already approaching. None of this commanded the galaxy. It listened to it. They placed observatories where the city taught best, at the edges of bubbles to watch rain become clouds, on the shoulders of dust lanes to watch clouds become stars, in the shadows of globulars to read the halo's thin handwriting. They learned the telltale when a lane darkened just so, when a whisper of long wavelength light grew a shade brighter, when the kinematics near a resonance shifted like a crowd preparing to cue. They turned these signs into gentle predictions and watched them arrive, not on human clocks, but on the galaxy's calm schedule. The story felt less like fate than etiquette. The city announced its intentions before it acted, and those who listened could prepare, tune instruments to a coming ring, point ears toward a forming stream, widen surveys along an arm about to sharpen. It was the oldest kind of wisdom dressed in starlight. Pay attention, carry memory, and time will speak plainly enough for anyone willing to wait. Galactic weather became a craft. Not forecast with umbrellas and commutes, but advisories written in kiloparsec fronts and million-year breezes. A tightening arm meant higher pressure along its shock, a season of blue villages lighting up and supernova gardeners pruning soon after. A bar strengthening suggested inner rings would glow, vents would open, and the circumgalactic sea would answer with a slightly heavier rain. Even cosmic rays had their patterns, rising with bursts, declining in lulls, pressing subtly on gas, and whispering to atmospheres on scattered worlds. The listeners learned to read these cycles the way sailors read tides, trimming sails of inquiry to meet them. During hot spells, they studied chimneys and fountains, the out-breath that seeded future rains. During cool spells, they mapped dust in exquisite detail, because shade was where the next generation would learn to fold. They found that the galaxy liked coherence. When many neighborhoods pulsed together, rings, arms, and vents, the city's efficiency rose. When rhythms fell out of step, it built more slowly but with equal care. Even mischief had a cadence. A satellite's nudge brought a predictable swell of lopsidedness. A discreet test passed by bar and arms with practiced counterweights, so the craft became two arts: anticipation and patience. Anticipation to meet the wave with instruments ready, patience to accept that arrival meant nothing if you couldn't stay long enough to watch the aftermath. Above all, the craft taught humility. Weather on these scales was never a command. It was permission granted by gravity and time, the same permission given at the beginning when fog thinned and the first scaffolds cupped the first drafts of light. Travelers learned the galaxy's roads, not straight lines through emptiness, but currents made by structure, the safe corridors between arms where shocks were gentle, the high lanes above the disk where fountains drifted, the quiet highways along streams in the halo where tides had smoothed the way. They built way stations on the rims of superb bubbles, dry docks in the calm lee of rings, and listening posts in globulars that saw the city from above and below each long loop. Navigation manuals spoke in the galaxy's own idiom. Catch the arm at this pitch and let its pattern carry you. Cross the ring's cue at dawn when pressure is kindest. Vault the warp's bow on the down breath and ride the returning wave home. Travel wasn't conquest. It was choreography with a partner too grand to notice you, yet dependable enough to trust. Along these roads, the travelers found curricula. They witnessed dust lanes giving way to bright knots, watched newborn clusters blow bubbles, and then dim into background, traced the spidery arcs of tidal tails until they faded into haze. Sometimes they caught the core's polite flares painting the halo with soft cones of ghost light, venting warmth that would return as mist months or millennia later, depending on the route taken. Everywhere, the lesson was one idea in different costumes, that a galaxy is a set of habits written on gravity's paper, and to move well inside it is to learn those habits by heart. They wrote their maps as songs because songs remember pattern better than chart. And when someone asked why all this mattered, they pointed to a quiet world in a mid-arm corridor and said, because roads connect stories, and stories are how cities know themselves. The bar aged with dignity. Its pattern slowed by imperceptible murmurs, like a grandfather clock losing a second each season. And that change moved the sweet spots where rings preferred to queue. Markets shifted, stalls migrated. The inner circlet tightened for a while, then eased. The broader ring edged outward by a neighborhood or two. None of it was jarring. Gas followed orbits that made sense for the mass at hand. Dust redrew its veils. The core kept its manners, and the halo held the floor level. In the maps of the listeners, these drifts looked like tide marks, pale bracelets inside of bright ones, ghost lanes flanking vivid scripts, evidence that the city had practiced the same letters in slightly different places over time. The slowing bar also shared work more freely with the spirals. Where once it had funneled with insistence, it now beckoned, and the arms responded by sharpening their shepherding. In those seasons, Starbirth redistributed, less concentrated in tight circlets, more generously sprinkled along the mid-disk. The ledger approved. Diversity of routes meant resilience of rhythm. If a satellite's nudge scuffed one lane, another could carry the load. If the core opened vents wider after a hearty sip, outlying festivals continued unbothered. And if the warp's nod sent a faint compression through the rim, the outward shifted ring happened to be there to catch it. Elegant, not because anyone designed it, but because the system rehearsed alternatives until one fit the mass and motion of the day. The bar would tighten again when circumstances asked. For now, the city wore its looseness well, a sash tied less strictly, a posture relaxed without slouching. Feathers sprouted from the arms, fine spurs that bridged the spaces between major lanes. They formed where turbulence tangled and where the arm squeeze met gas arriving with the wrong rhythm, creating side paths that crossed the main traffic. In these feathers, starbirth worked at a smaller scale, modest clusters hatching without the full pressure of a grand shock. The result was texture, beads not only on the arms themselves, but scattered like embroidery between them. Dust traced these spurs as faint oblique streaks. Ultraviolet light from young stars glowed softly along their seams, and over time many feathers dissolved, their stars added to the general handwriting of the disk. A few persisted, becoming recognizable streets that long outlived the nurseries that named them. The travelers loved the feathers because they offered shortcuts, gentle on engines, generous in views, safe from the heavier traffic of the main lanes. For the city, feathers did quieter work. They mixed chemistry across small distances, softened gradients within a single spiral gap, and offered refuges where clusters could age without the rougher weather of a main arm. In lean seasons, feathers kept the glow from going threadbare. In generous seasons, they provided overflow seating where pressure would otherwise have wasted fuel. On some worlds, skies under a feather carried a finer dust, sunsets more muted, nights with a faint silvery cast. The listeners filed feathers under grace notes, not essential to the melody, but responsible for much of its charm. The circumgalactic sea changed character with time. Early on, it was a hot, sparse reservoir, bright in invisible lines, dense enough to hold memories but thin enough to let storms pass. Later, enriched by 1,000 festivals and 1,000,000 chimneys, it grew more temperate in patches, condensing filaments more readily along old paths. Those paths became downspouts, a city's gutters reimagined in light years, guiding rain to the lanes that remembered needing it. In very late chapters, as deliveries from the broader web waned, the sea learned thrift. It cycled breath closer to home, smaller loops that sent mist down to the inner disk, and quickly reclaimed what heat rose there. The result was a tightening of weather, fewer grand fountains, more intimate exchanges, as if the city had learned to garden with dew rather than storms. This concentrism changed the face subtly. Outer lanes slowed their festivals, inner neighborhoods kept a soft hum, rings persisted as habits even when markets were quiet. To the listeners, the sea's evolution looked like handwriting aging, still legible, less flamboyant, more compressed, retaining the old flourishes only when needed. They built instruments to taste the sea directly, savoring its metals, its temperature ladders, its faint currents. Reading it felt like reading the galaxy's margins, edits, asides, reminders to self. There in the thin breath above the disk, you could find traces of every chapter, ashes of early giants, perfumes of red elders, the clean mineral scent of new rain formed from cooling gallops. If the disk was the city's face, the circumgalactic medium was its aura, subtle, expanding, carrying hints of who it had been and where it would spend its last brightness. Buckling returned once more and left a clearer fossil. The bar, under the strain of its own efficiency, arched out of the plane and settled into an elegant expunate in silhouette, hourglass in the right light. This time, the listeners watched the entire performance. They saw orbits tilt, families of stars exchange angular vows, chaos briefly flare and then damp as a new brace found its footing. The resulting bulge was boxy, yet kind, stabilizing the inner lanes with fewer dramatics. Rings resettled with relief. The narrow circlet tightened, the broader one thinned, and the gap between them widened into an aisle you could see from any balcony in the city. Gas, ever practical, queued where the new geometry said linger and left alone the spaces that whispered coast. The core, cushioned by the brace, needed fewer vents. When it did flare, the chimneys rose cleaner without rattling the rafters. From the mid-disk, the X looked like a lantern cage around a hearth, an architecture that warmed by organizing rather than by burning. In the halo, streams adjusted to the slightly altered pull, their cursive lines bending by degrees, but keeping their grammar. The peanut would remain, a long-lived memory in the face, a sign to any future reader that the city had chosen order at a moment when order mattered. Not a crown, not a scar, a joint healed and stronger. Time leaned into red. The youngest clusters still appeared, but rarer, and the elders' steady glow dominated. Red dwarfs, countless and frugal, took the long night shift. Blue festivals became local holidays, remembered because they broke quiet rather than set the tone. Dust lanes thinned a shade, their veils still useful, but woven from fewer new grains. Supernovae, when they came, sounded like the last loud hammers in a workshop near closing necessary jobs, finished with care, followed by sweeping. The city did not dim so much as mellow, it curated light. Worlds under this glow saw longer winters, slower springs, subtler summers, written in the colors of their skies. The bar still braced, the rings still cued, the arms still wrote, but all at tempos that favored endurance over splash. Occasionally a gas-rich stray brushed the rim and sparked a pastoral renaissance along an outer arc, blue beads lighting like lanterns at a festival that would ring the city once and then settle into memory. The core, nearly quiescent, opened vents on schedule more than in response, housekeeping for a hearth that kept its embers tidy. The circumgalactic sea, downshifting to dew, kept the inner gardens watered. In maps, the galaxy looked serene, spiral handwriting that had learned cursive, a signature legible from any distance, patient and proud. If born once meant fog thinning and first stars shouting, it now meant something quieter. A willingness to keep making beginnings in small, appropriate ways, long after fireworks had ceased to be the currency of wonder. Even embers tell stories. White dwarfs cooled into black, then to colder ideas still. Neutron stars kept their rare, fierce pulses. The central engine napped with a mass it would scarcely increase again. Globulars persisted as stubborn calendars, their orbits marking out centuries no clock could keep. The halo streams faded toward invisibility, their chemistry still distinct for those willing to listen. That deep in the disk, spurs dissolved into smoothness, feathers fell out of fashion, lanes blurred into gentle gradients of age and metal, planets aged into museums and gardens and ruins and seas. Some learned to move house when their suns grew unruly. Some chose to sleep through the changes. The city itself, no longer a builder at scale, became a conservator. Its greatest act of creation was to keep what it had made from unraveling, and yet little births persisted wherever conditions aligned, like wildflowers after rain on stones that everyone had given up on. If someone had stood at the start and the end and asked whether this quieter face belonged to the same being, the answer would have been yes, because the habits remained: gather what comes, cool what can, kindle what should, regulate the rest, and remember memory. In the end, may be the brightest light the galaxy makes, because memory tells the next cloud where to settle, the next ring where to form, the next traveler where to look for roads that only exist when you believe in them enough to begin. The listeners, descendants of those first eyes under a striped sky, left their own streams, not of stars, but of meaning's beacons tucked into globulars, where time flows long, archives buried in dust lanes where shade preserves, markers left along ring aisles and metals that no weather erases. They did this not to command the galaxy, but to speak with it, to add margins to its margins, to say, We were here, we listened, we learned your grammar, and wrote a few stanzas in your hand. Future readers, who might never know oceans or dust or the soft hiss of rain in a circumgalactic sea, would still be able to hear them, because patterns outlast particulars. A spiral is a promise, a ring is a plan, a stream is a sentence, a bar is a brace, a warp is a nod, a chimney is a breath, a globular is a clock. How galaxies are born was never a single moment. It was this: the patient rehearsal of rules that turn fog to cities, the regulation that keeps appetite from erasing tomorrow, the tenderness with which old light makes room for new, and the courage to let change be continuity in a different accent. The story ends the way it began, with a hush that feels like potential. Darkness is not empty. It is a stage being cleared. Somewhere, a scaffold cups the first drafts of light. Somewhere, patient dust waits in lane. Somewhere, a bar will rise to brace what needs bracing. Rings will cue, arms will write, and a small world will look up and say, "Tell me how," and the galaxy will answer by doing it again. Elsewhere, scaffolds cupped new beginnings. The fog wasn't universal anymore. Much of it had lifted ages ago, but in certain quiet pockets, the night still felt like wet silk, cool and thick, perfect for starting over. There, invisible hills gathered the thinnest breath of gas and held it like a promise. Tiny knots formed, smaller than grand cities, more like villages, and in each knot, chance met patience. The first stars that lit were loud, the way all first stars are, carving hollows, scaring the neighbors, throwing metals into the mix like spices flung from a hot pan. Most villages flickered. They would blaze for a few million years, blow themselves thin, and rest. But some learned cadence: breathe in from the web, breathe out through small chimneys, cool in the shadow of dust, try again. Reionization, an old sweeping dawn, had once made life harder for gas to settle, warming the background and thinning clouds. These pockets found workarounds in shade and shelter, behind filaments that acted like windbreaks. In time, a few villages threaded together and spun, writing soft spirals that would never grow into metropolises, but would be honest towns with good roads. They made clusters that dissolved into the field, beads that rolled across the shallow gravity and were still somehow kept. A tiny bar might rise, a hint rather than a brace, guiding gas toward a baby ring that winked and faded. From far away, these dwarfs looked like smudges. Up close, they were laboratories where the recipe of galaxy making was practiced at small scale. Gather what you can, spend a little, learn fast, waste little, and keep your vents open. Not every beginning has to be grand to be true. The universe kept a soft corner for these efforts, the way a forest shelters seedlings along a fallen log. Beginnings breed begin. Some towns refuse to choose between order and wildness. We call them dwarf irregulars, though nothing about them is careless. Their gravity is light, like an open hand, and that makes every decision dramatic. A few supernovae in the wrong corner can chase gas clear across the map. A lucky ribbon from the web can turn a quiet block into a festival. Star formation here works in pulses, on, off, on again, as if the town is learning to breathe. One season a knot condenses and lights its biggest stars, throw tantrums and blow a cavity. Gas flees, cools in the outskirts, and then when the winds calm, it drifts back and tries another lane. Over many such breaths, metals accumulate, dust thickens, cooling gets easier, and the pulses grow steadier. Sometimes a grand neighbor passes and teases out a tail, drawing gas and a few stars into a long streamer. Along that streamer, pressure stitches beads, tidal dwarfs, small and brave, born not from their own halos, but from the debris of someone else's tide. They are proof that galaxies can be adopted into being, that a city can begin with second-hand bricks and still find its voice. In the irregulars themselves, you see the raw rules laid bare. Feedback is not the enemy of growth. It's the instructor that says, "Not so fast," and "Try over there." Their light is mottled patches of blue near fresh knots, amber from elders who survived earlier pulses, and their shapes are stories rather than symbol. No stately arms, no bar like a signature, just a record of weather, where winds blew, where shade held, where ribbon arrived, where patience paid off. In the ledger of the universe, these towns are margins full of experiments, and many of those experiments become the footnotes that teach bigger cities restraint. Elsewhere, gas learned to gather too well. In a youthful city with eager supply lines, traffic bent inward until the center swelled like a held note. Pressure rose, cooling raced to keep up, and for a brief incandescent era, a compact starburst ignited. A blue nugget, bright as a promise and just as expensive. Stars formed in a crush, shoulder to shoulder, their winds overlapping into a single breath that punched skylights into the halo. The core tasted lavish courses, vents opened like flues in winter, dust both shaded and suffered, thickening where it could, subliming where it must. The result wasn't ruin, it was a reset. After the blaze, the pantry looked rearranged. The inner lanes were warmer, lofted. The outer lanes, supplied by streams that never stopped believing in gravity, became the next focus. Star formation migrated outward, ring by ring, like ripples from a thrown stone. The once compact glow relaxed into something broader, softer, the way a seed swells and splits and sends its first leaves into the light. Listeners would later read the signatures, a steep metallicity in the core, flattening with time. A history of winds written as cavities in the circumgalactic sea. A bar rising to rout what remained with more care. Blue nuggets are not errors, they're accelerations. Episodes where a galaxy spends a decade of light in a season to gain structure it will use for ages. Afterward, the city remembers the cost. It trades frenzy for flow, redeploys dust as careful shade, asks the arms and rings to share the load, and lets the core nap. If you sketch the before and after, both are honest faces of the same being. A youth who sprinted, then a craftsperson who learned to pace the work so the workshop can stay open late into the good night. Once, a smaller traveler took the straightest path of all. A bullseye plunged through a wider disk. No fireworks at impact, no fireball, just gravity's clean percussion. A circular wave raced outward through the host's gas, compressing as it went, a moving front where the air agreed all at once to light. A ring galaxy was born, a bright necklace expanding across the face, its beads almost continuous, where pressure peaked, and feathered where turbulence complicated the rhythm behind the front. The disk looked swept, gas thinner, dust lanes scrubbed like a beach after a sudden tide. Ahead of it, older arms waited to receive what the ring delivered, fresh clusters carried into their care as the wave broadened and slowed. The intruder continued on, losing speed and shape, unspooling into a faint stream that would become part of the host's halo sentence. For a time, the city wore geometry like jewelry, perfect circles traced by physics, too patient to be called dramatic. Listeners could date the event by the ring's radius and brightness, taste its chemistry to see how much of the host's pantry it had consumed, map the wake for signatures of turbulence that would become tomorrow's feathers and spurs. In years to come, the ring would fade into arcs, then spurs, then into the disk's general handwriting. But while it lasted, it was a lesson sung loudly. Compression organizes, organization builds, and even chance can look like design when seen from the balcony where patterns are visible. Not all spirals are born by the same recipe. Some inherit rings as a first stanza, then learn to write arms afterward, like children who doodle circles and later discover cursor. The universe approves of this sequence because it gets the job done, gas becomes stars, and the city learns how to route traffic without forgetting to breathe. There were cities so faint you could walk through them in thought and miss them. Ultra diffuse. They looked like the softest smudges. A handful of lanterns strung across a plaza, little else. Their sizes rivaled grand spirals, but their lights did not. How such whispering faces came to be is a set of stories with overlapping truths. Some were puffs from early tempests, heated when young. They expanded like bread under too much yeast and never quite regained density. Others were stretched by tides, their inner scaffolds intact, but their gas siphoned away by neighbors until only spare stars and stubborn clusters remained. In a few, dark matter's hand felt stronger, cupping the fragile glow so gently that what little light existed could spread without being torn. The clusters were the clues, globulars too bright for such a dim host, jewelers' pins that said something massive held us while we formed. On certain maps, these ghosts became important as connective tissue, their halos merging into broader structures that made the clusters central giants possible. For travelers, the ultra-diffuse offered night-like velvet and vistas that made patience feel like a virtue. For the ledger, they were low-budget successes, long-lived, low-burning, maintenance light. Not every galaxy must blaze, to be honest. Some are libraries with most of the shelves empty and a few rare books displayed under glass. Those books, the clusters, carry the memory of a brighter youth, of a time when gas was thicker and collapse easier, of festivals now long ended. And yet, even here, small beginnings linger. A ribbon crosses, a compression nods, a blue bead appears on the outskirts like a candle lit in a chapel. The city is whispering, but it is alive, and in a universe that values variety, whispers have their own gravity. Closer to the crowded heartlands, a different drama wrote itself in tales. A spiral dove into a cluster's hot wind and became a jellyfish. Its gas, caught by the headwind, streamed backward in tendrils that glowed with newborn stars. Rope lights ignited by pressures, they were pulled away. The disk's leading edge, stripped clean, went pale. The trailing side wore its luminous rags like a comet's. This was loss turned into workshop. Even as the city starved its core lanes, it germinated villages in its wake. Some beads on the tendrils would live briefly and dissolve into the intra-cluster light. Others would cohere into dwarf companions, swimming behind their parent like fry behind a fish. The central pantry thinned. The bar, if one had been there, lost its cargo. The core dozed. Yet the halo's deep cup kept the stars bound, and the cluster's own gravity gathered the shed material into broad, shared streams that smeared soft glow between giants, a common sky made from individual sacrifices. The jellyfish phase passed as the spiral's orbit carried it beyond the worst wind. What returned from the experience was a quieter face, an armature of old stars with a memory of bright, painful beauty trailing behind. On the ledger, the event read as real allocation gas converted to light outside the city walls, inner neighborhoods quenched, not by decree but by weather. In some cases, later rain would settle and modest rejuvenation would kindle along the rims. In others, the silence. The cluster, meanwhile, kept the light, weaving it an enormous cloak, a reminder that even when a galaxy cannot keep its fuel, it can still write stars into the shared story of its neighborhood. On gentler orbits, a different miracle occurred: rejuvenation. A red, comfortable city, its arms faint, its rings polite, its bar more posture than pump, caught a cold stream the way a dry garden catches a passing shower. The drizzle arrived along the halo's remembered filaments, condensed from fountains, seeded by the city's own past vents, and slid down with uncanny timing. Shade-weighted dust lanes, thinner now but competent, draped over the inflow, pressure-weighted. Rings that had never quite forgotten their cues. Roots weighted, a bar ready to brace again if asked. The result was a blue-green blush, a season of modest festivals spangling lanes that had mostly told stories of elders. This wasn't a rebirth into youth. It was a second spring in a practiced household. Chimneys reopened, the circumgalactic sea shortened its loops to make the most of each breath. Supernovae gardened carefully, pruning without scorching. The face brightened, gradients sharpened briefly. Travelers found new feathers to fly, and listeners updated calendars with quiet delight, predictions revised, instruments repointed, patience rewarded. Then, as always, the stream thinned. The city exhaled, tidied the benches, and returned to glow. The memory of color remained in clusters that would age into amber, in metals that sweetened the pantry, in dust that learned new shade tricks. Rejuvenation proved a point that had been hiding in plain starlight since the first scaffolds cupped the first drafts. Quenching isn't a verdict, it's a posture. Change the weather, and the posture can change too, if the body has kept its flexibility. That flexibility, rings that remember, bars that can return, lanes that can shade, is what a lifetime of building earns, not immortality. Chance. Beneath the visible lanes, a softer architecture threaded the city. Magnetic fields, too fine to see, strong enough to matter. They arched above dust rivers, braided within filaments, and gave turbulence preferences like grain in wood. Cosmic rays, swift, invisible messengers from supernova hearts, pushed lightly on gas, adding a pressure that wasn't heat but behaved like weather, all the same. Together, these unseen hands turned chaos into aisle. They slowed collapse where patience would pay better, guided it where a nudge would help, and carried charge and heat in ways that made chimneys draw cleaner and fountains rise farther. In starburst episodes, fields kinked and strengthened, frame bracing under load. In lean seasons, they relaxed, keeping their lines like scaffolding, awaiting the next facade. Dust aligned in their grip, polarizing light like a subtle signature that listeners learned to read. When a bar flexed, the fields found new loops. When a ring brightened, they draped the cue. When a feather formed, they stitched it to the arm. Nothing was dictated, everything was suggested. The result was fewer dead ends and more hallways that led somewhere useful. Even planets felt the difference. Winds from their suns braided with the galaxy's larger weather, space weather becoming climate in ways that made auroras tell wider stories. If gravity was the law and gas the citizenry, magnetism was custom habits that make a place feel coherent without anyone writing them down. The city's recipe never mentioned fields explicitly. It didn't need to. They were in the way dust settled, in the way chimneys climbed, in the way filaments chose routes through the disk. To miss them was to think a library is only paper and ink. To see them was to notice the shelving, the aisles, the hush that makes reading possible. Not all light belonged to cities. In clusters, a soft ocean of stars pooled between galaxies, intra-cluster light, the faint glow of lives unbound. They came from many roots, stripped by tides, peeled by headwinds, teased from dwarfs, donated during mergers, and they gathered into a shared halo that turned the cluster's core into a country with one sky. At its center, the brightest galaxy fattened, a seedy giant with an appetite for orbits, its own halo blending into the common sea so smoothly that borders lost meaning. In that sea, streams persisted as brighter currents, the cursive of old events still legible. Globulars floated like lanterns at a night festival, some bound to the giant, others to the cluster itself. their loyalties elastic on timescales too long to matter to anyone but archivists. For travelers, the intracluster ocean offered roads of its own, deep, slow lanes with nearly featureless weather, punctuated by the occasional eddy where a subcluster stirred the calm. For the ledger, it was an investment pool, spreading light where no single city could keep it, thickening the gravity that held the whole region together. Birth happened here too, rarely but honestly, when compressed tails sparked as they trailed behind jellyfish spirals, their beads aging into free citizens of the common sky. The existence of this glow taught a quiet moral: ownership is negotiable at scale. Stars care more about the shape of gravity than the colors on a flag. The universe, fond of both households and commons, wrote both into its design. And when listeners mapped that faint light with instruments tuned to whispers, they saw the full history of the cluster not as a file of separate biographies, but as a braided saga, a tapestry where threads left looms and still found their way into the pattern. At last, the story curved back to beginnings, not by circling in place, but by reaching far enough forward to find the rhyme. In the remote future, when fuel is sparse and blue songs rare, scaffolds will still cup small luxuries of gas in sheltered corners. Behind a dwarf shadow, inside a halo's cool eddy, along a stream that took a patient route there, dust reborn slowly from elder breaths will shade little pockets until molecules can dare to hold hands. A spiral song may be too faint to hear, a ring may be more memory than market, a bar may be posture without cargo. But the rules won't have changed. Gather, cool, kindle, regulate, remember. A single cluster will light in a place that looks unlikely, and in doing so will justify 1,000 years of quiet. A traveler will pass and call it a village. A ledger will record it as interest paid. A listener, if any remain under skies that still carry the galaxy's soft smear, will mark it as proof that becoming is stubborn. And somewhere else entirely, another web, another set of scaffolds, another hush that feels like potential. The whole grammar will start fresh. Not because the old song was wrong, but because songs are meant to be sung more than once. The simplest comfort in all this is not permanence, it is recurrence. The universe prefers habits that keep options open. Galaxies are one of those habits. They are how darkness practices making room for light without wasting night. And so, even as our city mellows, a quiet stanza begins someplace new. If you could listen from both ends at once, the first breath and the last, you'd hear the same lesson in different keys. Patience builds, balance keeps, memory teaches, and beginnings find a way. A misaligned delivery gave a city a second set of streets. A narrow stream, cool, stubborn, flying at right angles to the disk, slid into the halo and refused to flatten. Instead, it circled the host's waist like a hula hoop tilted toward the poles. Gas gathered along that high track, and in time rode a crisp ring that stood nearly perpendicular to the main lanes below. Stars hatched there, blue villages strung along the rim of sky, and dust laid faint veils that traced the new road. From the mid-disk, the spectacle looked like an elevated railway. From above, it felt like a compass needle pointing out of plane. The two systems negotiated. Where the polar ring crossed the disk, pressure rose and small knots lit. Where it sailed above emptier suburbs, it kept its own weather. The bar, if present, had little say up there, yet it influenced deliveries indirectly by steadying the core so winds didn't rattle the scaffolding. Over years, the ring precessed, slowly changing the angle of its shadow, like a sundial that refused to settle on 1 hour. Some of its gas bled inward and joined the main pantry, adding a foreign accent to local chemistry. Some sloshed outward, feeding companions like a generous aqueduct. To listeners, polar rings were letters written in 3 dimensions, proof that galaxies are not flat arguments, but layered conversation. They kept records of supply lines, of tides that arrived askew, of a halo's quiet hand making room for a road that logic would have rejected if logic had been in charge. The city learned from the visit, practiced resilience, not by erasing the ring, but by harmonizing with it. Two sets of streets, two climates, one patient law underneath. In a calmer century, strength turned into subtlety. The bar, after ages of hauling, softened until its straight backbone blurred into an oval, neither arm nor ring, but a lens. Inside that luminous lens, orbits became rounder cousins of their former selves, still organized, less insistent gas, showing impeccable manners, adjusted without complaint, cues shortened, shocks eased, and the narrow inner bracelet that once sparkled like a hot forge, cooled into a polished band. Starbirth didn't stop. It spread smaller hearths, more rooms lit, fewer bonfires. The bulge wore this change like better posture. A boxy hint remained from past buckles, yet the overall glow read like a lamp shaded just enough to soften edges. Spiral arms, freed from the bar's strict schedule, took on more of the routing, sharpening where needed and loosening elsewhere. Dust lanes, once stark in their guidance, thinned into gentler veils that allowed warmth to escape without scalding newborns. The ledger noticed the dividend, less wasted heat, fewer tantrums to vent, more light per unit of breath. 2 eyes below, the transformation looked like a temper mellowing with age, a workshop shifting from heavy lifts to precision work. Lenses could last, or they could foreshadow the next brace. Nothing here was permanent, except the habit of choosing what fit the current mass in motion. If a fresh drizzle fattened the inner pantry, a bar could regrow. If deliveries stayed modest, the lens offered grace without strain. Either way, the moral stayed the same. Structure is a verb. Bars, rings, lenses, these are stances a galaxy takes to keep building without breaking. Names are just labels pinned to a moving target. Far out, where the disk thins and the warp nods to misaligned memories, a pale frontier learned to glow. The air was lean there, pressure low, dust sparse, spirals more suggestion than command, yet a slow drizzle from the halo pooled in scalloped arcs, and spiral songs, faint but regular, pushed just enough to tip clouds from almost a yes. Villages of blue appeared like lanterns strung along a distant pier, each one small, honest, and surprising. These outer festivals didn't roar. They pipped and stitched, threading stars into regions once written off as too thin to matter. Feathers, those oblique spurs, helped, bridging between arms so gas arriving late could still find company. Over time, these outskirts wove the disk larger from the rim inward. Not a wall built from the city center, but an embroidery added at the hem. Chemistry lagged, of course, metals fewer, cooling slower, but fountains and migration worked their patient mix, drifting flavor outward so collapse could proceed without tantrum. Travelers adored these lands. The sky felt open, the dust like silk rather than velvet, the view of the halo crystalline. Listeners learned a new craft there, how to read Starbirth below the usual thresholds, how to find pressure in whispers rather than shouts, how to see a ring's influence fade into the free hand of flared gas. The ledger praised the return on patience. A little shade, a hint of squeeze, a drizzle met on time. Together they turned nearly nothing into a modest something, repeated across a circumference too wide for any one map to capture. Inside-out growth, people called it, though the truth was more musical. Themes introduced downtown, echoed softly at the edge, then braided back toward the middle as migrants carried the tune home. Layer by layer, motion thickened. Even without storms or intruders, a disk ages into depth. Clouds jostle stars. Transient arms trade momentum like friendly wagers. Feathers tidy loose ends. Rings coax traffic into lingering. Each nudge is small. Added up, They lift some stars above the crisp plane and drop others below, inflating a second sheet of orbits that puffs the city's profile. This thicker layer keeps the memory of leavier years, warmer motions, rounder routes, a tolerance for mess. Newcomers prefer the thin lanes at first, where handwriting is neat. Veterans spend more time in the mezzanine, where the view is better and the rules are broader. Gas feels these moods. In the thin sheet, shocks are sharper and births faster. In the thick, pressure spreads and collapses more gently, favoring steadier clusters over showy outbursts. Migration stitches the two together, passing chemistry between floors until gradients soften but never entirely fade. Over long spans, the balance itself evolves. If deliveries stay generous, the thin sheet remains dominant, writing fresh spirals with a confident hand. If the pantry leans austere, the thicker voice grows louder, and the city's light warms as elders carry more of the chorus. None of this marks decline. It's simply how a body settles into its strength, bones denser, breath slower, stride practiced. Listeners traced the age velocity whispers and smiled at the story. No sudden moral, just the arithmetic of countless gentle shoves. The ledger wrote the lesson in tidy script. Durability comes from distributing stress, and beauty from making the distribution readable in starlight. Once, the heart wandered. A small companion, hungry and bold, delivered its own dark seed to the core, and the two black hearts merged, not silently, but with ripples so fine only the fabric of space noticed. The new engine received a kick, a subtle shove that set it pacing slightly off-center for a spell. Stars near the middle felt the odd tug. Gas saw a lamp flicker where a lamp had not flickered before. The bar steadied the house, the bulge absorbed the sway, rings tightened their cues as if bracing for a gust. The engine's walk slowed as it shook hands with surrounding mass, dynamical friction in polite close, and the hearth reseated itself in the center it had briefly left. What it learned on that short wander mattered. Vents work best when aligned, flares stay local, when the braces square, necklaces fit truest, when the clasp sits at the throat. The halo, collector of stories, kept the receipt in a faint off-axis swirl that only the keenest maps could tease out. Listeners filed the episode under rare but telling. Hearts don't often roam, but when they do, the city's architecture pulls them home, not by command, but by the simple preference of orbits for balance. If anyone asked what danger had been averted, the answer was mundane, not catastrophe, just inefficiency. Even a small misalignment wastes breath. Even a short walk scuffs the floor. And so the core's manners, already good, became exemplary. Meals shorter, vents cleaner, flares timed to housekeeping rather than spectacle. The center remembered that its best trick is not drama, it's alignment. A city can hide its brightest decade under the softest blanket. When deliveries are rich and dust plentiful, star birth may move behind curtains, luminous in far-off colors, muted in the visible lane. Clusters hatch shoulder to shoulder in cocoons. Newborns carve cavities that glow like lanterns seen through fog. The whole district radiates warmth you can feel with instruments tuned for it, yet looks modest to naked eye. These luminous winters, infrared summers really, spend fuel fast but efficiently, because dust returns what it absorbs as calm heat that helps drive chimneys without scorching nurseries. The bar becomes a backstage crew, routing fresh parcels to scenes mid-performance. Rings act like orchestra pits, full and focused. The core, aware of the density, vents often and gently, preventing a roar from spilling into chaos. To travelers, the neighborhood hums, a thrum you sense more than hear, while the sky above shows fountains rising like invisible plumes. When the curtain finally thins, dust dispersed, winds eased, the set reveals itself, carved pillars of gas, cleared aisles, a population of young stars already aging into steadier light. The ledger calls the phase what it is, a concentrated investment. The city emerges with new structure, chimneys in the right places, roads swept, grains of dust reseeded in envelopes of calmer elders. If later maps show fewer blue fireworks, it's only because much of the making happened in a spectrum that eyes are poor at loving. The galaxy, indifferent to our favorites, did the work anyway and left the warmth in the archives for those who know how to read it. A timid neighbor learned courage by losing its edges. Tides from the host tugged at a small rotating town until its spin stuttered and its gas, harried by the host's weather, grew scarce. With each close pass, stars were puffed into rounder orbits. With each season, blue knots dwindled. With each handshake, the remnant looked less like a pinwheel and more like a soft sphere. Quenching followed, not decree, inevitability. Without fuel, lanterns go out. Yet the new face held dignity. Its globular clusters, forged when youth was raucous, hung like earrings on a calm brow. Its stars remembered their birthplace and chemistry, even as their motions forgot the dance. The host gained a companion of a different kind, no longer feeding the rim with ribbons, but lending gravity to sculpt streams and mild warps with gentle, ongoing tugs. In the halo, a thread remained, a thin receipt tracing the stairway down from disk to spheroid. Listeners didn't mourn the loss of arms. They read the biography correctly. Tidal stirring is not erasure, it's translation. A star-forming story becomes a story about memory and structure. A gas-rich dialect becomes a dry, elegant prose. The town's role shifts from baker to archivist. Later, if a drizzle returns, rare but not impossible, the mellow face can blush again along its edge, a ring of youth skirting a calm core. If not, it keeps time. The ledger appreciates clocks as much as forgers. A galaxy needs both. Between births and burials, matter learned its small rituals. In dark lanes, atoms paired off, then added partners, building molecules that cooled the air by whispering warmth away. Those whispers let filaments condense, knots cross their thresholds, and clusters light. Around each newborn, radiation carved a bright bubble, an ionized room where molecules fled and dust drifted to the edges. As winds and light waned with age, the room dimmed, molecules crept back, dust clumped and grew, sticking in the quiet like flour taking water. Grains shattered in shocks, then coagulated in calm, their sizes changing the color of the shade they cast and the paths heat could take. This chemistry, simple, intricate, relentless, was the city's plumbing. It decided where pressure would win and where patience would tape. How quickly a cloud went from maybe to yes. It knit the fabrics that protected the next round. The arms, bars, and rings provided architecture. The molecule cycle furnished the rooms. Listeners traced these rituals with lines and spectra and learned to hear the tempo of assembly and disassembly, the lullabies and the thunder. In lean seasons, the cycle slowed but didn't stop. In generous seasons, it raced but didn't run away, because feedback winds, light, explosions kept the budget honest. The ledger loved this loop. It was the quiet economy that turned gas into stars and back into gas, with improvements added, metals, grains, memory, each pass making collapse a little easier where it should be, and a little harder where haste would waste. No formulas were needed to witness it, only patience, good ears, and respect for the small. Taxonomies softened into biographies. The tidy sequence of shapes, ellipticals, lenticulars, spirals, irregulars, stopped feeling like boxes and started reading like tenses. Around elder, not just E, but once merged, now resting, light curated, fuel scarce. A lens bar hybrid, not S0, but braced to lens. Inner markets calm, arms outsourced to mid-disc. A sharp two-arm spiral, fed well bar, helpful, rings precise, dust lanes in full voice. A flocculent thing, many local stories, feathers abundant, central government light touch, and so on, each face a chapter, caught mid-page rather than a label pinned to a specimen. The shift mattered because it taught the listeners to look for verbs: gather, cool, kindle, regulate, migrate, remember. The same verbs combined differently yield different faces. The same face can hide different verbs at different times. Even the giants at cluster centers, often cast as finales, acquired nuance. Maintenance, flares, fountains to do, adopted light in common sky, occasional ring from captured ribbon. With biographies came empathy for variety. Some cities would never wear grand bars, some would never learn stately arms, some would live as lace, some as domes, some as necklaces that rewrite themselves after every tide. The ledger adjusted to auditing became mentoring, not fit the category, but mind your vents, spread your risks, keep your shade. The universe, it turned out, wasn't filing galaxies. It was tutoring them, one habit at a time, in a classroom as large as the dark. From the same striped sky where the first listeners once asked, how? A later generation stitched a map of nurseries and memorials, 10,000 rings, 100,000 feathers, 1,000,000 chimneys, then folded the paper and put it in a drawer labeled ongoing. They knew the map was wrong the moment it was finished, not because it was careless, but because the city does not sit still. That didn't make it useless. It made it a snapshot of a verb in mid-conjugation. They left space at the margins for corrections, a new polar road, a lens where a bar had been, a blush on a rim grown quiet, a softening where a cluster had gone to seed. Their instruments cooled, their archives warmed the future. And overhead the galaxy, ours, theirs, everyone's, kept the only promise it ever needed to keep. It continued the craft. Fresh drizzle condensed in the halo and found a lane. Dust joined hands in shade. A knot crossed its threshold. A cluster lit and blew a bubble. A vent opened. A ring cued. A bar considered returning, and then did. A migrant star traded neighborhoods. A traveler found a road where charts had only guessed. If anyone asked quietly under a sky still striped with our city's light, how are galaxies born? The answer would arrive the way dawn does, not all at once, but enough to see by. Giant clumps once stomped across a young disk like bright, unruly children in a museum. The gas was thick and turbulent then, a stormy broth where pressure and motion made gravity's job easier, not harder. In that weather, the spiral didn't write tidy lanes. It birthed islands, massive star-forming clumps, as wide as small galaxies, each a fierce workshop of blue light and winds. Some clumps blew themselves apart, their own tantrums too strong for their scaffolding. Others learned to hold together long enough to migrate, their bulk tugged inward by the very wake they made, like ships drafting on the waves they stirred. Piece by piece they drifted toward the center and delivered their stars to the bulge, layering a heart that would later steady the whole city. Along the way, their outflows seeded fountains, lofting enriched air into the halo, which cooled and returned as rain that knew where roads would someday be. The disk, bruised but wiser, gradually traded clump chaos for quieter lanes. Where islands had once shouted, spirals began to hum. Dust learned to lay smoother veils, shocks sharpened into gentler squeezes. The bar rose as a brace rather than a battering ram. If you looked at the light ages later, you could still find the clumps' biographies, ancient, slightly puffed stellar families embedded in the bulge, their chemistry carrying the accent of rushed childhoods. Listeners filed the era under compaction, not for a formula but for a feeling, the way a city gathers itself, burns bright in tight quarters, and then exhales into structure that lasts. Lamps didn't ruin the future. They wrote its scaffolding, paying in blue coin to buy a calmer, longer-lived glow. Sometimes a city wears a tilted smile. One whole side of a disk grows brighter or heavier, a single arm reaches farther than its mirror, and the center of light sits a street off from the center of mass. Lopsidedness isn't a mistake, it's a mood, a nudge, one whisper in the ledger's language, a one-arm persuasion. Causes vary. A shy dwarf can pass and pull, leaving the face unequal for a while. A ribbon can arrive from the halo at an angle and feed one quadrant more than the others. Even the bar, flexing, can transfer a little momentum here, a little there, and give the arms uneven confidence. The result is a long, slow sway. Stars feel a gentle tug toward the heavy side. Gas finds pressure where asymmetry deepens and answers with clusters. Dust veils thicken where the skew says, soon. The city doesn't let the imbalance become a habit. Migration softens it. Fountains spread flavor. The halo's steady hand nudges the weights back toward the average. Bars and rings adjust, routing traffic to underfed lanes, the way a good foreman moves crews to where the work is thin. Sometimes the lopsidedness fades. Sometimes it settles into character, a permanent lean that travelers learn to love because it makes the skyline distinct. In spectra, the listeners read the smile as a set of tiny offsets, motions that don't quite match perfect circles, a brightness that leans by a polite percentage. They can date the mischief by how far the sway reaches and how strongly gas follows. The lesson isn't symmetry for symmetry's sake, it's flexibility. A galaxy can carry an uneven load and keep its cadence, correcting slowly and kindly, feeding the quieter side until two arms once again speak in comparable voices. Metals tell of kitchens and the roots between them. Early on, the innermost streets ran rich. Elder starbursts salted the air, dust thickened, cooling quickened. Farther out, the menu was simpler. Clouds collapsed more slowly. Blue festivals burned bright and brief. That made a gradient sweet in the center, plain at the rim. Then the city tried new recipes. A compaction lit, and winds lofted metals outward. Fountains rained flavor on the suburbs. A cold stream slid in and fed the outskirts more than downtown. For a while, the gradient inverted edges tasted richer than the core, like a bakery that set up satellite ovens while its main room cooled. Listeners traced these flips in starlight, reading iron and oxygen the way historians read ink. Young stars near the rim, speaking suddenly with downtown accents, elders in the bulge holding to old spice. Over time, mixing in migration softened extremes. The city settled into a flatter stew, gradients present but kinder, with swells where rings cued and dips where winds had scoured. None of it required equations to admire. You could follow the flavor with instruments tuned to color and see how memory traveled. Supernova ash carried by chimneys, drizzled by the circumgalactic sea, caught by dust veils like flour on a baker's sleeve. Even quiet seasons matter. Without fresh fireworks, the metals shuffled more by circulation than eruption, a patient exchange between floors. When a dwarf delivered a ribbon, its foreign spice showed up as a streak across the map, a subtle vein that future clouds would sample. In the ledger, metallicity wasn't just a number, it was a travelogue where the city had burned hot, where it had cooled, where rain had fallen, and where rings and arms had taught the air to settle into stars with just the right haste. Bending waves, remember what hands have touched the halo? A satellite dives and the disk nods up on one side, down on the other. Then the nod travels like a ripple across wheat. These vertical waves last because gravity is fond of oscillations that distribute rather than destroy. Long after the culprit dissolves into a stream, the disk still breathes with a corrugation you can map if your ears for motion are keen. Stars bob, gas slides to the compressions and lights. Dust thickens where the wave crests, and the warp at the rim precesses a slow metronome set by misaligned memory. Travelers learn the rhythm like sailors learning swell, cross on the down breath for smooth passage, linger on crests. Where pressure favors small beginnings, the halo helps absorbing and returning momentum until the pattern softens into habit. In the thick layer above and below the crisp plane, the wave writes deeper, telling which episodes were loud and which merely murmurs. Listeners compare quadrants and find the signature: one arm a hair higher, one side's outskirts slightly busier with blue, then follow the telltale into the halo and retrieve the dissolved guest from its faint cursive. What looks like a wrinkle is a file. It contains the date of the nudge, the mass of the hand, the angle of approach, all encoded in the amplitude and the reach. Meanwhile, the city builds through the breathing, because building doesn't require a flat floor, it requires a predictable one. Rings cue with a tolerance for the nod, bars brace with a little extra arch, chimneys tilt and still draw. The wave does not deny the plan, it decorates it, adding a subtle lilt to a song whose tempo gravity keeps no matter who tried to hum along too loudly for a while. Some neighborhoods go quiet, not because they are tired, but because they are well built. When the bulge and bar have grown sturdy and the inner disk has learned order, gas there can find itself too stable to collapse. It's a paradox that isn't. Strength makes stillness. The city calls it morphological quenching, though the phrase feels more like a posture than a rule. The inner lanes keep their dust veils, rings still cue, chimneys open on schedule, but pressure doesn't rise to the tipping point and clouds stay poised rather than committing. Starbirth migrates outward to where the balance is more easily disturbed, mid-disk lanes, feathers, the rims of old bubbles. The result is a hallmark face, redder at the heart, not empty but curated. A green valley glow migrating outward like afternoon light along a wall. This isn't a forever verdict. Tilt the circumstances and the posture changes. A bar can regrow and rote a little extra fuel inward. A drizzle can cool the inner air. A minor merger can jostle the map and create pockets where collapse whispers now. The listeners learn to read the quiet as an active state, the way a meadow stays still because many forces cancel, not because nothing is happening. They found molecular gas sitting in calm lanes, ready as pantry flour, and understood that silence can be a kind of loaded spring. Later, when a polar ring grazed the throat or a fountain shortened its loop, the inner bracelets rekindled with neat, efficient sparkles, as if the city had been practicing the choreography off stage. In the ledger, quenching wasn't a failure. It was a conservation plan. Save fuel, reduce waste, keep vents clean, and let the outer beds bloom while the inner ones rest. A bead formed at the throat, a nuclear star cluster where orbits are tight and time is dense. It grew by two crafts at once. First, migration. Small clusters born in the inner ring and bar-struck lanes spiraled inward over long seasons, their stars drizzled into the nucleus like sand into a glass bowl. Second, in situ birth. Gas shepherded by the bar slipped into circlets around the very core and kindled there in exquisite metal-rich mini-festivals. The central engine watched, separated by a distance measured less in meters than in manners. When it fed, it opened vents, and the bead paused. When it rested, the bead assembled quietly. Neither ruled, both negotiated. Over ages, the nuclear cluster became a jewel box, Stars of many ages packed tight enough to share a sky the size of a city square. Its gravity smoothed the very inner traffic. Its light warmed the throat with an amber that instruments could separate into chapters, a burst from a century ago, a lull, a trickle, a compact festival that left a faint ring scar resolved only by the keenest eyes. To travelers, the nucleus was a lantern seen through lattice, the bar's X casting shadows, the bead glowing steady. To the ledger, it was a stabilizer, a flywheel of starlight that kept the core's housekeeping on temp. Nuclear clusters did not exist everywhere. Some cities wore only the engine's ember at the heart. But where beads formed, they said something hopeful, that even close to a hunger capable of swallowing light, the recipe can make rooms for gentle craft, provided vents are clean, roots are wise, and deliveries fit the spirit. Not all jewels are born as clusters. Some are carved from larger lives. Ultra-compact dwarfs drift like brilliant seeds, too bright to be mere clusters, too small to be old galaxies with all their limbs. Their biographies read bluntly, once the hearts of larger towns, stripped by tides and harassment until only the dense nuclei remained. The stars in them tell the tale, ages spread across many seasons, metallicities richer than their sizes would suggest, motions tight as spun wire. In the halos of bigger cities, these compact elders orbit as adopted jewels, contributing gravity and glamour in a package you can mistake for simplicity if you don't listen closely. Sometimes they carry a secret ember, a small black heart of their own, evidence that even tiny thrones once had conductors. Listeners learn to pick out their signatures in crowded fields, light too concentrated for a globular, spectra too complex for a simple bead. Travel near one, and you feel a tug disproportionate to its size, a reminder that density remembers even when outskirts do not. On cosmic maps, ultra-compact dwarfs trace the paths of past violence, strings of pearls along old tidal lanes, solitary gems where stripping ended long ago. For the ledger, they're efficient keepers of memory, low maintenance, high information, sturdy on long time scales. And for the city that hosts them, they're too. They teach the disk how easily arms can be lost if weather turns harsh, and how much strength can be packed into a heart learned through surviving. When a compact dwarf passes a dust lane and its light tints a nursery's veil, you could imagine the lesson spoken aloud. Build well at the center, share what you must at the edge, and if you are ever pared down, let what remains be enough to start stories in others. Out in voids where neighbors are few and the web's filaments are taut and thin, galaxies grow unhurried and blue. Fuel isn't abundant, but neither are thieves. The air is cool, the winds gentle, the roads empty. Spirals there keep their handwriting longer. Bars rise late or not at all. Rings exist as fond habits rather than busy marketplaces. Dust is modest enough for shade but not for curtains. Supernova gardeners work in small teams, pruning with care, and because crosswinds are rare, asymmetries are often born, not from tides but from the lopsided way streams arrive, one quadrant fed, another fasting, yielding faces that look hand-drawn and charming. Listeners love void galaxies because their biographies are cleaner to read, fewer hands have edited the paragraphs, metallicities lag but aren't stalled, gradients form and hold, migration still circulates, but with an almost musical laziness that puts stars on new addresses without losing the neighborhood's accent. If a dwarf does drift by, its passage is a headline for a century, not a daily commute bump. In such isolation, worlds can count on quieter skies, less radiation background, fewer dramatic flares from a restless core. That doesn't guarantee stories under those skies, but it does give experiments more time. For the ledger, void spirals are slow burn investments, low risk, steady yield, ribbons of blue stitched at a pace that keeps the pantry fed without prompting the core to tantrum. When they finally meet company falling into a wall or grazing a group, their first title tales are calligraphy written by a hand that never practiced on rough paper. Patterns learned in peace acquire character in contact. The universe needs both lives, crowded cities that teach resilience, and country towns that teach steadiness. The light carries accents that ages cannot erase. Stars forged in hurry speak with quick consonants. Enhanced by elements from early supernovae, they glow with an urgency that says, "We were born when time was fast." Stars formed later in calmer kitchens sing with softer vowels. Iron-rich words stretch by patience. In the thick layer above and below the crisp plain, the older dialect dominates, a testimony to clumpy youth and turbulent seasons. In the thin sheet, many dialects mingle, spirals shepherded by bars and rings, feathers stitched between arms, ribbons delivered from donors, all adding syllables from elsewhere. Listeners learn to they take spectra and parse the grammar, magnesium balanced against iron, oxygen leaning this way or that, calcium whispering about the clocks that set the beat. They map these accents across the disk and halo, and the galaxy's personal history appears as a linguist's dream, districts that keep ancient speech, lanes where young slang thrives, neighborhoods where migrants soften the local cadence. The ledger becomes a library of pronunciations. Alpha-rich means quick cooking and prompt explosions. Iron elevated means longer simmer, more type 1s spice. None of this requires chalkboards to love. It takes ears for light and the patience to see that each star is a sentence about conditions at birth. When those sentences gather into paragraphs, clusters, moving groups, streams, whole chapters of a city's life can be reassembled. You can point to a ring and say, "Here the bar fed the circlet and the bead glowed." You can trace a feather and murmur, "Here turbulence tangled and stitched a shortcut." You can look into the bulge and hear the clump era explain itself without apology. Accents do not divide a city, they make it legible. The last lesson the galaxy taught its listeners didn't arrive as a finale. It showed up as a practice you could adopt in a workshop right now. Keep vents clear. Shade what needs time. Root fuel where pressure is kindest. Split large meals into courses. Let strong bones quiet hotheads. Accept gifts. Label shelves. And don't be ashamed to pause when the pantry leans thin. Migrate gently. Let neighborhoods talk. Distribute stress so no single lane carries the whole story. Read the margins for memory. Write footnotes when you pass through. Be humble about forecasts and proud of maintenance. In lean years, cultivate thrift without panic. In generous years, avoid gluttony disguised as celebration. When mischief bends the face, brace. Redistribute and trust that balance returns with habit. When a neighbor needs something you can spare, expect the gift to return as rain someday, perhaps where you least predict. Above all, begin again quietly if need be, grandly if invited, because becoming is the only promise gravity makes that never goes stale. Standing under the striped smear of their city's light, the listeners realized the story called How Galaxies Are Born was never simply about the past. It was an apprenticeship. The universe had been demonstrating at scale how to build durable beauty from patience, feedback, and memory. They closed their instruments for the night, left small markers where future readers would find them, and went home under a sky that kept the craft alive, rings cueing, arms writing, fountains rising and returning, ready for 10,000 more quiet chapters that begin as they always had, with a hush that feels like potential. Edges are not lines, they're decisions. Far from the bright markets of rings and the crisp handwriting of inner arms, a disk thins until the lighting budget changes and the city must choose how to end the page. Sometimes it tapers into quiet starbirth dwindling, dust veils faint, lanes fading the way a shoreline blurs into fog. Other times, after a soft lull, the outskirts surprise with a second wind. A gentle upturned tear, blue villages appear again, stitched along a faint compression. Or a drizzle that prefers the rim. Listeners traced these endings and found they weren't endings at all, but breaks in strategy. Inside the first break, gas had been spent or stabilized. Beyond it, new supply arrived from streams the mid-disk couldn't easily catch. Feathers helped, tossing side paths to the edge. The warp's nod added a light squeeze. Migration ferried elders outward to teach younger neighborhoods patience. Under starlight, the profile looked like two stories married, a city that knew restraint inside and curiosity outside. Travelers loved these margins. Gravity felt softer, the sky wider, the halo closer. You could see the thin ink of streams and the pale glow of forgotten tales. Blue clusters here aged fast, weather is harsher, fuel rows are short, but their brief lives mattered. They salted the outskirts with metals, seeded dust grains that made shade possible, and left shells that later lanes would quilt. Some nights, a ring wave passed, and brightened the hymn like an applause traveling around an auditorium. Some seasons the hymn dimmed and held breath. In the ledger, the edge column was never blank. It carried notes in a tidy hand, break softened by drizzle, outer stitch active, feather bridge successful, warp compression modest. The city's face didn't end, it exhaled, and the exhale became another place to begin. There is a place in every well-run spiral where a song seems to hold a note. Stars circle, gas flows, and then their traffic slows without stopping. Not a wall, a wave, the pattern passing through the disk, hands off momentum the way dancers pass a weight, and the result is a line where cues form naturally, not because anyone orders them to, but because orbits agree it's comfortable. Inside this corral, rings kindle, just outside lanes loosen, further out, arms take the lead again. Listeners mapped these waypoints and found them drifting slowly over centuries, following the bar's mood and the arm's advice. When the bar tightened, the inner cue sparkled and the outer lane rested. When the bar eased and the arms sharpened, the balance reversed. Gas respected the choreography. It circled, hesitated at the sweet spot, cooled in the shade of dust, and then chose fold into clusters or continue to quieter streets. The core appreciated the etiquette. When cues ran well, vents could open calmly, flares, if any, stayed local. The circumgalactic sea found chimneys left ready. The waypoint, call it a resonance if you like labels, worked like a city square around which routes make sense. It taught the disk a modest trick. By pausing where pressure and patience meet, you spend less fuel for more light. That habit redistributes joy. Instead of a single downtown blaze, you get necklaces, circlets, and mid-lane festivals, all in their time. Travelers read the square the way sailors read tides, cross when the rhythm favors you, linger when it does not. And when a dwarf companion tugged or a ribbon arrived off-key, the square shifted its chair a little, making room, never abandoning the table. The ledger called these places hinges, the points that let a galaxy open and close its seasons without creak. Families were not limited to lanes. Two stars born shoulder to shoulder can spend a lifetime never meeting again, traded gently by ripples and whispers until one sings in the inner neighborhoods and the other hums near the rim. Yet, in their light, the accent of a shared cradle remains. The listeners learned to hear it. They weighed elements like spices in a broth and found matches, magnesium in the same balance with iron, oxygen, and calcium, telling the same tale of what kinds of fireworks salted the nursery, nickel and silicon agreeing like old friends, finishing each other's sentences. With these signatures, they rebuilt family trees from strangers. Siblings reunited, cousins identified, lost clusters reassembled as kin scattered across the city and even into the halo where streams carry adopted children on long loops. The rewards of this craft were stories with edges. Here a moving group, no longer a bound cluster, still shared the grammar of a ring festival that happened centuries ago. There a brood in the thick layer, all alpha-rich, confessed to hurried births back when clumps stomped across a hot disk. Sometimes a few siblings traced a feather back to the exact spur that stitched their lane. Other times they pointed outward, their chemistry whispering of a dwarf's far-off kitchen adopted long ago. This wasn't sentiment, it was structure. Families marked where shade had been honest, where pressure set the tempo wisely, where feedback pruned but didn't scorch. The galaxy never intended to keep track like this. Gravity cares for mass, not pedigrees, but the light carried genealogy the way rings carry rhythm. The ledger gained a new column, provenance, not just where a star is, but from what kind of room it began. With that, the city's biography gained human-sized chapters, and the map of kin became a map of method. Clouds learned the same manners at different scales. Giant mothers, vast, frayed, and patient, gathered along arms and rings, stretched by turbulence into filaments that braided like river deltas. Inside those tangles, smaller rooms formed, cold pockets whispering warmth away, protected by dust that dimmed the glare. In those rooms, knots learned restraint until a nudge from a passing shock or a slight rise in pressure turned almost into yet. Birth happened in clusters, not singletons. Tempers flared winds, light, the first tantrums, and then rooms cleared, leaving bright courtyards surrounded by pillars and shells that future clouds would use as scaffolding. The cycle looked messy from above, but its bookkeeping was tidy. A portion of gas became stars, a portion was lofted through chimneys to the circumgalactic sea, a portion cooled and returned as gentle rain, a portion lingered in dust and molecules, making shade for the next attempt. Even the failures served a room that didn't cross the threshold, kept its molecules intact, ready to try again when the arm returned with a firmer squeeze. Across the disk, the life of a cloud mapped to the city's habit. When bars ran strong and rings queued, clouds in the inner lanes tended to be denser, shorter-lived, their festivals brisk. When arms tufted and feathers flourished, clouds in the mid-disk sprawled longer and hatched in more modest, steady batches. At the rim where pressure was shy, clouds needed the warp's nod or a passing ribbon to commit. Listeners watched the courtyards clear and measured the echoes in long wavelengths, where dust tells the truth even after the lights go out. The ledger treated clouds like workshops, inventory in, product out, scrap recycled, fumes vented, tools maintained. No formulas were pinned above the door, only the rule: don't hurry. What patience can improve. Groups practiced a quieter gravity than clusters. A handful of spirals, a few dwarfs, some elders wearing smooth faces. Together they shared tides the way neighbors share fences. Bridges of gas, art between the larger cities, faint and elegant, streams of stars, pale as chalk, wrote the minutes of past passes. In groups, no one wine dominated. The air was cool, the headlong stripping of cluster centers rare. Yet the company mattered. A slow dance pulled a bar into being earlier than solitude might have. A mild nudge lit rings more often. A borrowed ribbon from one friend's outskirts rejuvenated another's hem. Over decades on the cosmic calendar, these neighbors exchanged gifts. Globulars handful by handful, gas parcel by parcel, tugs that corrected warps, embraces that briefly sharpened starbirth. From time to time, two near equals found each other irresistible and began a long courtship. Their discs scribbled, their tails lengthened, their cores tasted more than usual, and flared politely. The group accommodated. It absorbed the noise, kept other roads clear, and let fountains share metals into a common breath that future rains would draw from. Listeners learned to read a group like a conversation with inside jokes that bridge, a favor repaid that lopsided arm, a consequence of last winter's grazing, that unexpected ring, a shared stream, everyone forgot now. Returning as rain, travelers planned routes that used bridges as causeways, safe, low-pressure lanes between cities, and set way stations where the intragroup medium pooled. The ledger's group accounts were punctuated by the word alone. A galaxy's choices tell one story among neighbors, the same choices rhyme with others. The universe prefers rhymes. They spread understanding at low cost and keep surprises friendly. Second-generation cities wore hand-me-down halos along the luminous ropes that unspooled from major encounters. Pressure sometimes stitched beads that found their own gravity, born from debris rather than deep, invisible cups. These tidal dwarfs lacked heavy scaffolding but compensated with cooperative neighborhoods. Gas-rich, dust-thick, metals above their weight class, thanks to the kitchens they were born from. They formed clusters like young towns with 1,000 volunteers. They made lanes without insisting on bars. They learned to breathe early because the wind in their wake taught patience. Many dissolved once the rope's pull weakened, their stars sprinkled into the host's halo as commas in long sentences. A few endured, small and stubborn, orbiting the parent like adopted children with the family's accent but their own timbre. To listeners, these dwarfs were syllables proving a grammar point. Gravity assembles cities by multiple recipes. The canonical one scaffold first, then gas works across the web, another debris first, then self-organization works in the wake of drama. Both produce honest, both write chapters that future readers can parse by chemistry and motion. The ledger liked their efficiency. Without a deep, dark cup, they lived honest budgets, quick to build, quick to fade if streams dried, content to join a halo's commonwealth if not. Travelers stopped at them because they were generous with views, tidal lanes visible at human patience, and because they taught humility. Big cities do not own all the method. Where a ring once swept and left pearls, there might be, ages later, a town raised from a single lucky bead, its clusters warming a quiet orbit, its dust lanes thin but competent, its festivals small and sincere. The universe keeps the recipe on a note that simply reads, use leftover, season with time. Sometimes the city bent its own weather with a mirror it didn't know it carried. In the deep between galaxies, mass curves light, and a well-placed halo can focus a background lantern into an arc or a ring, a ghostly echo that wraps around the host's fate. To eyes that built calendars from light, these arcs were both art and instrument. They revealed the weight of the invisible, how the halo cupped space, how streams thickened this side or that, how the bar and bulge combined their pull. More, they turned the galaxy into a lens powerful enough to dissect a farther younger city, a view that telescopes alone couldn't muster. Through such self-portraits, the listeners measured the host without touching it and peeked behind it without moving. The galaxy did nothing new to cause this. Simply by existing, it shaped the paths that light took. In clusters, the effect multiple common halos made common lenses, and a single arc could trace the gravity of an entire neighborhood, revealing where intra-cluster light thickened, where seedy giants fattened, where jellyfish spirals had recently trailed luminous rags. The ledger filed these episodes under passive gift. No vents to clear, no cues to route, just the quiet donation of weight to the task of seeing. For travelers, lensed arcs were omens with content. They pointed to corridors where gravity runs steep, to warps aligned with deeper pulls, to outskirts where a future stream might prefer to loop. Not all mirrors reflect faces, some reflect fields. The city, unconcerned with optics, kept building. The arcs faded. as lanterns moved, but the map stayed, and with them, a more faithful picture of the frame that had always held the story in shape. Every long tail returns to neighbors. Far along their orbits, two senior spirals met again, their halos greeting before their stars did, their past streams recognizing each other like threads from the same cloth. This time, their pace was slower, their pantries leaner, their bars seasoned. The dance began as all such dances do, tides teased, arms stretched, rings ovaled, blue festivals lit where gas met gas with kindly pressure. But there was less to burn and more to remember. The cores flared only enough to keep vents honest, dust shaded enough to cool, not enough to curtain. Tales unfurled like calligraphy written by hands that had practiced on rough paper and now preferred elegance. In the merger's wake, a smooth elder could have formed, stars on random orbits, light curated, or, because enough cool breath remained, a new disk could have been spun. A second draft spiral sketched over boxy bones with a brace rising to route, rings reappearing as familiar marketplaces. The outcome, as always, depended on weather and weight. Either way, the halo gained literature, fresh streams to read, compact dwarfs to tutor, a thicker envelope to steady futures. The listeners, now archivists with long shelves, watched not for fireworks, but for craftsmanship. They saw whether the new rings cued with economy, whether feathers stitched without waste, whether the nucleus welcomed new beads politely. They knew by then that galaxies are verbs, and that verbs conjugate. Build had become rebuilt, balance, rebalanced. Remember, remembered. The ledger's final note on the pair was simple: rhyme achieved. Not repetition, rhyme. Enough similarity teach, enough difference to matter. In that nuance lay the reason the universe never tired of the same grammar. Context keeps the sentences new. Under all of this, the dark scaffold, the unseen hand, kept its promises. It didn't shine, but it shaped. Early on, it cradled fog and invited fall. Later, it steadied bars, cupped bulges, and kept whirling disks from flying apart when arms sharpened and blue villages lit. Over ages, it responded to the bright city it held. The bars pull rounded the inner scaffold, streams added weight to one side and then the other. Mergers kneaded the whole into a shape that fit the light better each century. The dance was mutual. Bright matter learned to route itself along the frame. The frame relaxed where the light insisted on grace. Listeners inferred this from motions, stars that moved a little too fast in outskirts that were too thin, gas that traced curves gravity had drawn with an invisible stylus, streams that looped, not randomly but in families that spoke of a halo with memory. They even heard the dark hand tug on time itself when black hearts merged, ripples whispering through the fabric underneath everything. No equations were required to respect it. The evidence was in every pattern that persisted longer than chance. The ledger gave the scaffold a standing ovation in absentia, for holding shape in storms, for accepting edits from light, for keeping the floor level when the music changed. In the end, the scaffold's humility taught a moral worthy of a city that learned patient strength does not need attention to matter, it needs attention to behave. Galaxies grew old not by defying their frames, but by making friends with them, aligning braces where the scaffold prefers, building rings where orbits linger, and letting memory accumulate in streams along the edges where the quiet hand is easiest to read. When the skies finally leaned warm and the chorus of elders carried most of the song, the work did not stop. It refined, rings lit like pearls on special evenings rather than daily markets. Arms wrote legibly with fewer flourishes, vents lifted due more than the circumgalactic sea tightened into local loops, returning breath to the inner gardens quickly, the way a workshop keeps rags by the stove. Out beyond, blue notes appeared where chance conspired. A ribbon brushed a rim, A warp crest added just enough squeeze, a feather offered a shortcut to a pocket that might otherwise have waited forever. The nucleus curated new beads in miniature, one every so often, enough to keep the hearth balanced. Travelers, by now poets of roots, continued to chart roads that mostly existed as habits, not highways. They taught their apprentices how to find pressure with fingertips, how to hear dust in colors, how to guess where a ring would cue by watching stars pause. The listeners, those first children of a striped sky now many generations broadened, wrote the craft down for the sake of ritual, not because the galaxy needed reminding. Then they folded the notes like sailors stowing charts and went outside to watch their city glow. There they found the deepest comfort the story had to offer, not in novelty, not even in grandeur, but in competence. A galaxy making beginnings at the right scale for its age, remembering its lessons, neither hoarding fuel nor wasting night. How galaxies are born, they concluded, is the wrong tense. Better, how galaxies keep being born, the verb stays present, the subject stays plural, and the object, light, is always treated with respect. The city learned to budget its shadows. In the calm between grand episodes, its air separated into temperaments, warm and patient, cool and cautious, cold and decisive, each layer negotiating with the others through whispers of heat and hints of pressure. Dust arbitrated, dimming the harshness just enough that molecules could settle into partnerships without being torn apart by light. In lanes where the handwriting of arms was crisp, the cool rooms multiplied like thoughtful workshops, filaments braiding until a nudge turned potential into glow. Elsewhere, the warm phase kept vigil, a buffer against haste, making sure the city didn't spend tomorrow's fuel today. Chimneys connected the floors, hot breath rose from newborn courtyards to the thin sea above, cooled and returned as mist, exactly where it would matter most. The old cycle out, linger, return ran on a thrift that felt like grace. You could walk a single street in thought and see all three temperaments at once, a quiet cloud poised beneath a gauze of dust, a warmer current sliding past, a faint draft pulling upward through a bubble's skyline. Nothing dramatic, everything essential. The ledger loved these seasons because they tightened tolerances. A cloud that would have failed in brighter weather now had time to finish folding. A pocket that might have collapsed into waste held just short of the line. Even the core approved, its events opening on schedule like breath in a practiced body. It was easy to mistake such competence for dullness until you noticed how little had to be corrected later. Good shadows repay themselves in fewer storms, calmer fountains, and clusters born with the quiet confidence of rooms prepared exactly to their needs. The city added another line to its plaque: light is our product, shade is our craft. Pulsing elders kept the time. Scattered through the halo and threaded through the thicker layer above the disk, they brightened and dimmed with a rhythm so faithful that entire maps could be drawn from their patience. Each beat was a note about age and distance, a lighthouse blink that told travelers where gravity had laid down safe paths long ago. Around them orbited globular clans, ancient, compact, stubborn, whose amber glow served as mile markers on routes the city had once taken in a hurry. Some of those clans carried subtle scars, tails feathering behind them, where passages through the inner lanes shook a few looser souls free. A tilt that remembered a buckle in the bar before the bulge learned its lantern cage stability. Others were serene as prayer beads, their stars bound so tightly that even centuries of tides only smoothed their faces. To the listeners, the pulsing elders and their hive-like companions were more than ornaments. They were the city's almanac. Count the beats, and you learned the scale of the halo, parse the clan's chemistry, and you tasted the first kitchens, mapped their orbits, and the gravitational bones of the scaffold revealed themselves without ever showing their face. In the disk below, young festivals came and went. In the halo above, the elders kept the long sentence legible. On soft nights, A traveler could stand under a thin portion of the city's smear and feel the rhythm as a kind of reassurance. Whatever storms had passed, whatever rings had kindled and dimmed, the metronome of old light still marked the measure. The ledger wrote this kindness down as reliability, and with unusual sentiment, added a note: memory that repeats itself becomes mercy. There were eras when the brace chose absence as an experiment. The bar, having hauled and buckled and healed into a dignified X, relaxed until its straight insistence blurred into suggestion. In that lens-like mood, the inner lanes acted from habit rather than command. Gas still queued where orbits preferred to linger, but the queues were shorter, the courtyard smaller, the rings more like polished bands than blazing bracelets. Spiral arms, given more say, sharpened their shepherding in the mid-disk and softened near the core, spreading festivals like lanterns along a river instead of piling them into a single square. The nucleus continued its beadwork with miniature patience, assembling stars in quiet circlets that glowed with an amber confidence. Dust recalibrated, trading thick curtains for careful gauze, so warmth could leave without scalding hope. The circumgalactic sea, attentive to the new posture, condensed broader sheets of rain that favored the outskirts and only later drifted inward, keeping the pantry fresh without crowding the hearth. Nothing about the lens demanded permanence. It arrived as a stance chosen by mass and motion, and it would depart the same way if a drizzle fattened the inner stores or a dwarf's nudge asked for a firmer brace. What remained after was the memory of competence, that a city can route without rails, can balance without obvious beams, can let the handwriting of arms and the etiquette of rings carry more of the weight. The ledger marked reduced waste, reduced tantrums, and an uptick in small, steady births that were easy to cherish and hard to squander. Structure, the city learned again, is not a noun. It's a verb that changes tense when circumstances. On clear evenings in the outskirts where the warp bowed like a polite nod and the air thinned to honesty, the threshold between almost and yes became a study in patience. Pressure was shy, dust was sparse, the spiral song arrived as a hum rather than a demand. Their collapse required collaboration, a faint compression from the warp's slow wave, a feather bridging a gap between arms, a drizzle from the halo condensing along a remembered filament, and a pinch of metals ferried outward by fountains or migrant. When those small favors aligned, a village lit, a blue punctuation mark on a page nearly blank. The village lived fast, winds carved a tiny bubble, supernovae gardened with a few careful cuts, then the glow softened to amber and joined the general handwriting of the rim. You could miss these outer musicals if you were only listening for crescendos. The listeners tuned their ears to whisper. They mapped scalloped arcs where the warp's crests kissed the disk. They followed faint dust veils that showed where shade would be most profitable. They watched as migrants from richer streets drifted into the edge and seeded the thin soil. Over a long paragraph of time, the hymn of the city thickened not by decree from downtown, but by embroidery from outside, stitches added with courtesy and restraint. Travelers loved these lanes because roads were made of habits here, not highways. The gravity was gentle, the halo close, the sky crystalline with the thin ink of streams. The ledger called the practice honoring the margins, an investment that paid in breadth rather than brightness. What looked like a simple fade was in truth a perimeter of second chances, proving that a city's best work often happens where its voice lowers and its patience lengthens. In a season remembered for subtle tricks, gas taught itself to hesitate wisely. Too cold and clouds shattered into fragments too quickly, too warm and they never committed. The city found the middle by letting turbulence do small, useful work and stopping it from doing large, destructive work. Filaments braided until knots formed at their crossings, But the braiding didn't whip itself into chaos because magnetic threads acted like fingers keeping the strands aligned. Spiral shocks pressed, then relented, rings cued, then released. Chimneys breathed at a pace that carried heat up without tearing rooms open. Within those prepared spaces, star clusters were born with the confidence of well-planned kitchens, ingredients evenly mixed, ovens preheated by patient shade, vents drawing cleanly, massive members still threw their necessary tantrums, winds, light, decisive farewells, but their fury pruned more than it wasted. The medium, as people like to say, found its manners. None of this erased drama when it was warranted. A dwarf's mischievous past could still tilt an arm into asymmetry, a ribbon could still sketch a ring on the rim, the core could still flare politely to keep chimneys honest, but in the average hour of a long century, the disk ran like a workshop whose foreman had learned everyone's strengths and scheduled accordingly. The ledger showed fewer stalled rooms, fewer runaway courtyards, more clusters reaching steady adolescence instead of burning out in infant blaze. If you had to name the virtue, it was restraint engineered into flow. A promise not to hurry what patience could improve. Galaxies are born from gravity's insistence. They endure on the strength of such small repeating decisions. Some faces smoothed into domes with stories folded inside. A pair of near equals after a youth of spirals and a middle age of braces and rings chose union that left no lanes to redraw. Their stars settled into random orbits, their gas spent or heated and lofted away, their bulge and halo thickened into a single calm glow. To a casual glance, nothing moved, but yet shells appeared, faint arcs, layering the outskirts like the lines of a shell's interior, each one the place where a stream of stars on elongated paths slowed and piled before turning back. Those shells were quiet thunderclaps, memory made visible, the afterimage of tides that stitched two histories into one. Dust took a lesser role. The circumgalactic sea became a reservoir for dew rather than fountains. The core flared rarely, more caretaker than conductor. Starbirth did not vanish. It retired to rare rings kindled by the brush of a passing ribbon or the donation of a timid dwarf, to brief necklaces that lit and faded like surprise parties. The ledger called these elders curators, cities whose labor had shifted from making to keeping. Travelers found grace in their symmetry and challenge in their subtlety. Roads were set by smooth gravity, not sharpened lanes. Vistas were of hush, not bustle. The listeners learned to read the dome as carefully as any spiral shell spacing told time since the last large handshake. Distribution of amber and rose revealed the mix of families laid to rest within. The weak breath of dew in the inner gardens said the body still remembered how to breathe, even after songs had gone soft. Birth had not, it had changed scale and meaning, becoming the art of meaningful exceptions. A winter with lanterns arrived. A luminous season performed behind curtains. Deliveries had been generous. Dust was confident. The bar, or the lens that replaced it, had routed parcels toward the center with tact. Instead of dazzling fireworks, the city chose a spectrum eyes overlook. In far-off colors, lanes glowed like embers beneath a quilt. Clusters hatched shoulder to shoulder inside cocoons. Massive members carved lantern rooms that radiated warmth. Chimneys lifted heat with minimal fuss, feeding the circumgalactic sea that now returned mist with impeccable timing. To ordinary sight, the neighborhoods looked modest, even subdued. To tuned instruments, they were loud with construction. When the curtain finally thinned, winds having swept corridors and dust having drifted to the edges, the set revealed carved pillars and cleared aisles, a street plan refined by an episode nobody had seen with naked eyes. The ledger adored this phase because it turned fuel into structure with very little waste, and because it taught a cultural humility that spectacle isn't the only proof of excellence. The core, ever disciplined, had vented lightly and often, preventing panic. Rings had cued with etiquette rather than urgency. Arms had contributed by compressing gently where needed and stepping aside elsewhere. Afterward, the city felt taller, more ventilated, its chimneys better placed, its rooms better proportioned. The newborns had already aged into steadier tones. The dust had reseeded in elders' envelopes. The sea above the disk held memories for the next drizzle. It was, in every sense, a winter that left spring in its wake. Not far from the stripe of sky where the first question had been asked, a small satellite turned archivist by necessity. Tides plucked its arms, winds stripped its pantry, its spin stuttered, its face round. Gas grew scarce, blue festivals ceased, and a quiet amber prose replaced the loud azure poetry of youth. Yet dignity remained. The dwarf's globulars, stubborn clocks, forged when the town still shouted, hung in gentle orbits, ticking through long loops. Its stars kept the accent of a kitchen that once ran hot. Its motion through the host's halo drew a thin, readable stream that joined the long sentences looping the sky. The dwarf's role shifted from baker to librarian. It kept time, lent gravity to sculpt mild warps, and offered a stable frame for future gifts should a ribbon ever pass its edge again. Occasionally, the host's festivals lofted metals and grains that drifted across space like pollen to settle on the dwarf's calm outskirts, where for a short season a ring of youth might. The ledger treated the dwarf with the same seriousness any blaze. Memory is an asset, it wrote. Clocks are infrastructure. The city learned from its companion the art of enough, how to carry identity after appetite, how to matter without spectacle, how to fold itself into a neighborhood without vanishing. In a cosmos full of births and feasts, such restraint was not an afterthought. It was a chapter in the same story, told at a volume that made the listeners lean in. Bridges turned strangers into kin. In groups where tides were gentle and patience abundant, arcs of gas stretched between neighbors like pale causeways. Along those bridges, pressure rose just enough to stitch beads. Small towns born in transit, their blue lights leading travelers from one city to the next. The bridges did more subtle work too. They equalized tempers. A bar rose earlier here because a companion's tug supplied the missing nudge. A ring cued brighter there because a borrowed ribbon topped off the pantry. A warp nodded less because the shared mass steadied the floor. Over time, the bridges frayed into streams of stars that wrote minutes of old meetings and widened into faint common halos where intergroup light pooled. The ledger kept track not of ownership but of flow. What moved mattered more than who claimed it. Dust crossed, metals crossed, clusters crossed, practices crossed as well. One city's efficient venting became another's habit. One town's feather-making taught its neighbor to stitch shortcuts. The listeners learned to read a group as an organism, shocks and drizzles propagating across light years like ideas. Through a village, when two larger members finally chose a closer dance, the bridges foreshadowed the grace of the merger, tales already traced, lanes already aligned, chimneys prepositioned by a century of shared weather. To the eye that loved only isolated spirals, groups looked messy. To the ear that listened for rhyme, they sounded like harmony sung by different voices in turn. And on a quiet world in a lane between arms, where the dusk to light felt like dusk in a beloved room, a child stood under the faint smear of the city and asked again, "How are galaxies born?" The answer arrived the way it always had, as a craft, not an event. The child heard it in wind through trees and in the careful cooking of a parent who knew that shade and heat have to take turns. They saw it in a river that braided and then nodded at a bend, in a town that queued politely at a square, in a workshop that kept vents clear and nose oiled. Somewhere above, a ring paused at a waypoint, a feather stitched a gap, a chimney breathed, a globular kept time. A dwarf learned to be a library. A bridge brightened with small lights. The city didn't know the child, but it had been teaching them since before there were words. The listeners, now mentors, now neighbors, handed the child a map with blank margins. Leave notes, they said. Others will read them when the lanes have drifted a little. The ledger, if it had smiled, would have done so here. Because the story is safest when many hands write it, and because beginnings keep their promise best when someone new is waiting to hear them. Overhead, the galaxy answered by doing the only thing it knows. It gathered, cooled, kindled, regulated, remembered, and in that patience, it began again. The apprentices of light learned that rings keep secrets in their ages. In one circlet near the throat, stars gleamed with the hush of midlife. In another, farther out, newborn chorus lines still shed glitter into the lane. The cues drifted over long seasons, sliding outward by a street or inward by a breath as the brace slowed or sharpened, and each drift left a ghost, an older bracelet of amber encircling a younger one of blue. Dust remembered the choreography in dark halos, faint tracks where shade once pooled deepest. You could read the sequence without numbers. The inner band wore the tidy look of neighborhoods that learned restraint early. The outer band hummed like a market at noon. Between them, a gap breathed, a quiet aisle that made brightness legible. When a dwarf's ribbon arrived and pressed the outskirts, a temporary ring brightened there as well, beads along a scalloped arc that later poured into the nearest arm. Thus the city carried 3 anniversaries at once: last century's necklace, this decade's bracelet, and today's wreath at the rim. In maps tuned to patient colors, their ages layered like tree rings tipped on their side. The lesson was hospitality. Rings weren't decorations. They were round porches where gas paused long enough to become citizens. They shifted with the house, never rigid, always useful, moving so slowly that stars aging in place wrote calendars onto the floor. When the brace buckled and healed into an elegant X, the rings took the news with poise, tightening or loosening by a block and lighting anew where orbits negotiated comfort. It was simple: linger where the city invites, kindle where pressure is kind, leave a ghost for future readers. The apprentices wrote it down and then put their notebooks away. From that night on, they could see the bracelets with the naked eye. Dust learned to paint with chemistry. Close to impatient clusters, tiny aromatic rings, sturdy little molecules caught ultraviolet applause and blushed, glowing like coals under stage lights. Farther from the glare, ice-frosted grained surfaces, water, carbon chains, and shy companions wrote cold calligraphy on mantles, a molecule thick. Shockwaves from loud farewells shattered grains to powder. Breaths from gentler elders regrew them, rounding sharp edges into velvet. Each change altered the shade's tone. Sootier veils in lively districts, crystalline gauze in quiet halls. Shade wasn't absence, it was. Under that protection, atoms rehearsed together, whispering heat away in wavelengths. No eye sees, teaching clouds how to cool enough to fold without shattering. The city's smell, if light could carry scent, shifted with the palate. Warm spice near veteran bulges, frost and pine at the rim, the faint sweetness of carbon chains in lanes where festivals had recently dimmed. In luminous winters performed behind curtains, dust did its finest work, drinking hard light and returning it as calm warmth that chimneys could carry upward with dignity. Later, when winds had swept the rooms, dust slipped to the edges, outlining pillars and shells like contour lines on a map. Travelers learned to steer by it, follow the darkest syllables, and you'd arrive where almost becomes yes. Watch for its thinning and you'd know a courtyard had just cleared. Even planets rid the palette, disks with richer soot cooled faster, and built rocks where air could cling, bare mantles made colder, clearer rings of ice. Nothing about this painting stayed fixed. Grains shattered, grew, clumped, and drifted, a slow brush redrawing lanes over centuries. Sometimes the past left a neon note on a distant wall, a brief crown at the heart, bright for a season, then courteous again, bathed the remote cloud in a sudden noon. The core dimmed, the city returned to hum, but the cloud kept shining, greenish and strange, as if a lighthouse beam had painted it and moved on. These light echoes were love letters written to the future. They told the truth about appetites that eyes had missed. The intensity of the lamp, the angle of the flare, the time since the outburst, all preserved in gas that fluoresced like a sign after closing. Listeners mapped these ghosts and found them perched like moss on the underfaces of streams, hanging from the rims of old cavities, floating above the disk where chimneys had lofted breath long ago. The echoes were charitable. They gave history to places with no clocks. On quiet afternoons of cosmic time, a smaller brace rose inside the larger one, a bar within a bar, like a secret hallway opening from a familiar room. The outer timber hauled from the mid-disk, feeding broad rings and keeping the pantry sensible. The inner rod, shorter and quicker, turned at its own tempo, shepherding gas through miniature spirals that stitched the throat. Together they performed a deft handoff. Parcels slid from arms to bar, from bar to bar, from inner lanes to tiny circlets, tucked close to the central lantern. There, metal-rich stars formed in exquisite batches, pocket festivals, whose light aged into a warm necklace around the engine's hearth. The two braces didn't always agree. For a while their rhythms crossed like waltz and reel on the same floor, and the gas chose whichever tempo offered the kindest pressure that afternoon. Then the inner bar would drift into beat with the outer, and efficiencies bloomed. Deliveries smooth as conveyor belts, vents opening on cue, no tantrums required. If the city grew leaner, the inner brace faded first, its job done. If generosity returned, it reappeared as naturally as a muscle, remembering an old useful move. Listeners loved these nested tools because they turned speculation into sight. Where confusion reigned in maps, the inner rod explained the tidy rings. Where beads clustered too close to the core to formed by chance, the handoff offered a route to travelers. The hidden hallway was a delight. Companions rarely arrived from random angles. They preferred avenues traced by the cosmic web, so satellites often aligned in rough sheets, skimming the halo like birds following a river. Feedback didn't only prune, it sculpted foundations. When starburst tempers rose and fell in quick succession, they shook the central mass like a drumskin, pushing and pulling on the unseen hand beneath. What began as a tight, steep grip softened into a keener hold, and the orbits of inner stars relaxed from fretful to fluent. The change didn't shout, it showed in motions: fewer sharp turns, more grace, fewer trapped paths, more streets where traffic flowed. Gas respected the new posture. In a softer center, it found room to slide without crashing, to queue without crowding, to form stars without tripping alarms. At the hearth, the engine benefited too. Vents ran cleaner when the grip mellowed, flares stayed local, and the nuclear bead assembled with fewer interruptions. Listeners inferred this quiet remodeling by listening to light as it moved. Stars near downtown no longer hurried quite so anxiously. Shells from old outbursts lay farther out than expected. Clusters born afterwards spread more evenly, as if the grid had been redrawn straighter. The ledger loved the outcome because it was cumulative. Each gentle storm, handled well, massaged the heart toward a configuration that wasted less energy. Sculptors call it taking off what doesn't belong. Here the chisel was made of winds and light, the stone was the invisible scaffold. Over ages, the city's core learned to hold without clenching. That was good for everything. Rings ran smarter, arms fed safer, chimneys drew steadier, and travelers found fewer snarls in the innermost streets. The lesson was counterintuitive only once. Spend some energy now in organized outbreaths, and the future spends less cooling chaos. Galaxies are stubborn, but their hearts are coachable. Given time and rhythm, they trade grip for balance, and in doing so, they buy themselves calmer centuries to build. Ages wrote themselves as lines of light in the city's side view. The thin layer, crisp, youthful, obedient to spirals, shone like a polished blade. Above and below it hovered a thicker sheet, older, warmer, a survivor of earlier weather that hazed the profile into a soft lantern. Out toward the rim, both layers flared, widening where gravity's hand loosened and misaligned memories tugged the floor. Listeners treated this cross-section like tree rings turned on edge. They measured how the thick sheet swelled toward the center, where clumpy youth had once jostled, and how it thinned toward mid-disk, where spirals had taught patience. They mapped where feathers stitched the layers together, oblique streets that let stars trade floors without drama, and where shell-like ripples remembered a small companion's plunge from long ago. In the language of light, the city confessed its history, a hot-headed adolescence that puffed orbits high, a contemplative middle age that grew a clean, thin script, a practiced present blending both into a durable silhouette. Gas felt the difference. In the thin sheet, shocks were neat and starbirth brisk. In the thick, pressure was spread and clusters grew steady rather than spectacular. Migration looped through both, blurring gradients into kindness without erasing them. Travelers reading the profile knew where to fly. Engines purred in the thin lanes, sails did better in the thick. Where turbulence softened, the ledger noted the dividend of depth. Stress distributed, stability earned. Cities that developed lantern profiles weathered surprises with poise. A nudge bent one floor, the other held shape. A wave passed through the thin script, the thick spelled continuity beneath. Tree rings tell of winters survived and summers spent well. So did the layers of starlight, and the galaxy's side view became a portrait of resilience, written in two hands that learned to write together. Sometimes the city flung a star so hard it left and did not return. A three-body argument near the heart, a close pass by the hidden ember, or an untidy breakup inside a tight cluster. Any of these could send a sun skimming above escape like a pebble flung too fast across a pond. Hypervelocity travelers, the counters called them. Messengers, said the poets. They carried the accent of their birthplace into the silent between heavy elements, betraying a central kitchen or a leaner mix, whispering of outskirts where blue festivals burned quick. As they went, they mapped the city's pull by defying it, drawing faint contours on the invisible field. Some passed through distant halos and tugged on their streams. A few sailed the void lanterns without cities, teaching emptiness what a single sun can look like up close. Back home, their departure left small adjustments. A cluster lost a note and retuned. A nuclear bead swallowed momentum and sighed. A dust lane shrugged off a flicker and kept shading the next room. Listeners learned to read the tidy chaos in the core by counting how often these messengers launched. Too many, and the hearth was misaligned. Too few, and the center clutched too hard. The ledger liked the balance a healthy rate implied. Energy was being redistributed, not hoarded. Crowded streets were clearing. Long orbits were being offered to stars that could carry the city's biography far afield. In myths on a certain world, wishes hitched rides on such stars. Practice, data did lines in a spectrum, tiny shifts in color, a speed no neighborhood could claim. The galaxy, indifferent to romance, but fond of good logistics, used the departures to keep its center honest and its outskirts informed. Under brightness, a softer economy minted miracles in miniature. Between dust grains, on cold mantles, atoms found one another and learned to linger. Hydrogen paired and then danced with oxygen. Carbon strung itself into patient chains. Nitrogen joined partners that would one day teach color to skies. These molecules cooled clouds by whispering heat away, shielded fragile rooms from glare, and built the modest stickiness that let grains clump and disks around young suns grow from smoke into pebbles, from pebbles into stones, from stones into world. Much of it happened out of sight, under gauze, in rooms that looked empty from a casual glance. But if you tuned your ears, the chemistry sang, a chorus of faint lines saying, soon, long before light said, when supernovae hammered the neighborhood, mantles shattered into glitter, and the cycle reset. Fragments drifted, stuck again, and rewove the veils needed for the next attempt. The city became a patient chemist. Mix, cool, test. If a room failed, adjust the shade. If a room succeeded too violently, vent and try smaller batches. Even planets learned from the laboratory. Those born with generous dust inherited atmospheres that clung. Those with lean mantles preferred rings of ice and clean, cold air. Travelers charted this quiet economy because roads ran through it. Far-off lanes glowed in colors set by chemistry. Vents breathed more steadily where mantles were fresh. Rings cued better when molecules had time to practice. The ledger wrote in small letters for this chapter because its miracles happened at scales humans love. A handful of atoms, a pocket of shade, a first bond. Galaxies are proud of fireworks, but they live by slow kitchen. The city kept its burners low, its counters clean, and its recipe cards smudged with use. Practice became tradition. Across arms and rings, in feathers and at rims, the city repeated the same courteous steps until even surprises fit inside the dance. A dwarf grazed the outskirts, feathers stitched a bridge, rings cued along the ripple, vents opened and the ledger balanced by evening, deliveries thinned, dust deepened shade, fountains shortened loops, and starbirth refocused on lanes where patience made the most of little. A brief crown at the core, chimneys drew, beads paused, the halo condensed, rain along the rims, the outburst had warmed. The choreography wasn't rigid, it was remembered. Every neighborhood kept a few rehearsed moves. How to seed a gap with quiet clusters, how to use a shell's rim to coax a ring, how to tidy after bubbles merged. Travelers reading the sky saw maintenance as beauty, windows cleared without scarring, courtyards carved and then swept, skylights placed where future weather would need them. Listeners stopped waiting for finale. They tuned their instruments to competence, because competence, multiplied across 100,000 light years, looks like grace. In the elders' archives, a line in a tidy hand captured the spirit of the age. We have fewer emergencies because we practice the ordinary. That ordinary included wonder. Children still looked up and found blue villages flaring on the rim, a polar ring still tilted like a question mark. A lens would soften, a bar would return, a jellyfish would trail lanterns through a headwind, a compact jewel would circle like a relic with stories inside. The city, for its part, did not congratulate itself. It stacked another row of bricks, opened another vent, labeled another shelf, and began again. Tradition, after all, is just practice that decided to